Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had a voice in his head part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Asmallwasp from fanfiction. So let's start the video. The morning is here. Izuku groaned and rolled over in his bed. The morning is here. Izuku groaned again, his exhaustion rolling over him so heavily he might as well have been drowning. The morning is age. Crush. Izuku jumped up with a start, staring at where his fist had landed, above his alarm clock. Izuku blinked slowly, raising his arm and pulling away the former clock. The clock was essentially warped metal and plastic now, and the wooden desk under it held cracks and splinters were strewn across the ground. He stared at his hand, which held no injuries or marks, even after busting his alarm and desk in a single hit. It looked completely normal. How did I? Oh look, you're awake. Izuku yelped as he looked around, only seeing his room, the same as always. He frowned slightly. He knew he'd heard the voice. It was so clear. Aren't you a hero? I thought heroes didn't oversleep. Izuku jumped again, his head on a swivel as he searched frantically for the sound. Was he going insane? Hello. He tried tentatively. I'm in your head if you're wondering. Izuku blinked, and when he opened his eyes, he wasn't in his room anymore. He jumped as his eyes processed what they were seeing. It was a large room, completely dark except for the light that entered through a window that took up almost all of the front wall. Izuku turned and blinked. The window showed his hands, legs, and floor, exactly what he'd been seeing before entering this room. He looked around, seeing a wall of bookshelves lined against the wall opposite him, the right wall of his mind. The books resembled his hero analysis journals, almost eerily so, and Izuku had a chicken and the egg moment for a brief second. You would think you, of all people, wouldn't be surprised by this. A black-haired teen leaned against the wall beside the bookshelves, arms crossed. The teen looked well-built, dressed in a dark t-shirt and jeans. Small scars littered his face, barely visible through the light of the window. Izuku tried to look him in the eyes and froze. The eyes were a dark brown but were almost lifeless. It made the teen look like some of those retired heroes Izuku sometimes saw walking down the street. Izuku averted his eyes to the ground, unable to take the cold stare. How hadn't he noticed him? I'm not sure how I'm here or who I am, but I know I'm skilled in a few things, hiding in plain sight being one of them. How did you? Your thoughts are broadcast here. I found that out a few seconds ago, the teen replied, and Izuku realized his mouth hadn't moved. Izuku shook off his shock and stood, suddenly getting defensive. Who are you? He yelled, trying to hide his fear of having someone in his head. The teen winced sharply as Izuku's voice echoed through his head, his hands jumping to his ears. Izuku did a double take. I'm so sorry, he exclaimed. I didn't mean to hurt you. The teen waved it off, his free hand rubbing his ear. It's fine, he said, actually speaking this time, though I'm getting some intense déjà vu from it. Izuku stopped at the sound. It was deep and gravelly, like stones crunching together, and gave the teen the impression of being much older than he looked. To answer your question, he continued, standing straight. I don't know. Izuku asked slowly, his panic being met with confusion. How wouldn't you know? The teen shrugged. Don't know. I woke up here, was force-fed your memories, learned Japanese through them, and now I'm here. You saw my memories? Izuku asked in shock. The teen recoiled again, wincing, and Izuku quickly apologized. I didn't have a choice, the teen told him. I didn't know they were yours at first, either. I thought it was me until I realized you were here. I don't remember most of them either. My memory is really messed up, he explained, rubbing his neck. Just bits and pieces here and there. Who? Izuku shook his head, realizing that asking who put him here would probably get the same response. Do you remember anything? He asked instead. The teen paused, lost in thought for a moment. My name, he replied after a small time. What's your name? Marvin, I think Marvin told him, holding his head. Izuku relaxed slightly. Somehow, hearing the name put him somewhat at ease. Marvin wasn't a complete stranger anymore. Well, you said you don't remember anything? Izuku asked, and Marvin shook his head. It's weird. It's this fuzzy thing, Marvin muttered, speaking aloud again. I don't remember what it is. A person, maybe. You remember somebody? Izuku questioned. Do you know any traits? Maybe we can find someone you know and get you in your body. Marvin shook his head again. I can't. I can't even remember how old I am or where I come from, let alone a person. Izuku paused, his mind running 1,000,000 miles per minute. Marvin hadn't made any attempts to attack him or use whatever quirk he had. If Izuku discounted the cold eyes anyway. Izuku shivered a bit. That couldn't be his quirk, could it? But if it wasn't, why were they so dead? He shook it off, getting back on track with his thinking. Okay, so Marvin probably wasn't a villain. Why would a villain target him anyway? He hadn't told anyone about All Might after all. The lack of memories made it seem like Marvin was planted in his head, but who would go through the trouble of doing that and not remove Izuku? What could their plan be? Could it be an accident? But what kind of accident could not only erase memories but transfer someone's consciousness into another person's body? Or at least Izuku thought it was his consciousness. No one had ever disproved the idea of a soul before. But if it was a soul, then what kind of quirk could target it? He hadn't heard of a quirk like that and didn't know any mixture of quirks that could possibly explain what had happened. What's a quirk? Izuku jumped, his head snapping up at Marvin. Marvin stared at him curiously, his head tilted to the left. The coldness in his eyes had lessened, but was still present, kind of like a bad smell. You don't know what a quirk is? Izuku gaped. It was one thing to not have a quirk, but to not even know what it was. Marvin's brows furrowed. Hold on, I'm going through your memories again. What I remember of them anyway. He frowned after a moment. It's a superpower? Why don't you have one? Izuku bowed his head, staring at the floor of his mind, which had suddenly become of great importance. Oh, I'm sorry, Marvin said after reviewing more memories. Didn't mean to drag any bad memories back up. Izuku tried to wave it off. It's fine. People have said worse to me. Marvin blinked. Hey, I just remembered, weren't you supposed to meet that one blonde dude? All Fight or something like that, right? Izuku's eyes widened. All Might. Izuku, now in the real world, stood sharply from his bed. Is it just me? Or are you kind of short? Marvin asked. Izuku blinked. He could see Marvin in his head, staring out the window that Izuku now knew were his eyes, seeing what he saw. I'm average height for my age, Izuku replied as he quickly changed, feeling oddly normal at Marvin being in his head. Marvin shrugged. Don't know, this view looks weird. I thought you said you didn't remember anything? Not really. It's weird, it's like remembering a dream. I know I knew people, I know I lost people, and I know someone. Can't remember who. Izuku rushed out the door after a quick hug and goodbye to his mother, running over to the beach where he was cleaning up trash. He quickly got to work, cleaning up a few tires and putting them onto the mountain of trash he'd made. Marvin watched in mild interest. The feeling of déjà vu was back. Seeing Izuku run across the beach and work felt familiar. But to his frustration, Marvin couldn't remember anything. Izuku grunted as he worked, slowly pushing a small truck across the beach with hisses of effort. Hey, Marvin said suddenly. Don't push like that, it'll hurt you. Izuku paused and stood, wiping sweat from his brow and panting. Well, how should I? He asked, hands on his knees. Marvin took a metaphoric step forward and blinked. He was in Izuku's body, feeling weird at the height Izuku was. He stared at Izuku's hands and flexed them, seeing small muscles bulge across his forearms. Hey, Izuku yelled. Give me my body back. Marvin raised his hands in a sign of peace. I didn't mean to do it. I swear. I was just trying to help. Izuku blinked, and he was back in his body again, standing on the beach next to the truck. We can switch control? Izuku asked aloud, garnering some odd looks from passers-by, though him pushing a truck shirtless across the beach would have gotten those anyway. Ugh, that feels weird, Marvin groaned inside his head, feeling nauseous. He shook it off slowly. Do you think there's any change if we switch? Like physically? Why would there be? Izuku asked, brows furrowing. Well, you looked surprised that you broke that alarm earlier, and I'm pretty sure I took over for a moment then. But I don't have any super strength, Izuku pointed out. Exactly, Marvin replied. You think there are physical changes? Izuku hesitated, weighing his options. On one hand, they could switch again and potentially find out more about the quirk that put Marvin there. On the other hand, it could also be a trap. It's not like he knew Marvin. Can't you just take control back? Marvin asked. I mean, it's your body after all. You'd think you'd have some sort of priority over it. Izuku eventually nodded, hesitantly handing over control to Marvin. Marvin took an awkward step forward, feeling like he was compressed in clothing that was far too tight. This feels... He trailed off, looking for the words. Marvin blinked, feeling his senses open up around him. Sounds and smells strengthened, colors became more vibrant, and his skin became almost sensitive to the touch. He looked around. His sight was good enough that he could read the license plate of the car on the other end of the street, and he could hear chatter from people walking by as clear as day. Okay, this feels... Marvin paused and smiled slightly. It feels familiar, you know. He frowned, his brows furrowing. It's like listening to an old favorite song that you remember the lyrics to, but listening to it on low volume, where you can't really make out all the words. Izuku blinked inside his mind. Your senses were stronger than this? He asked excitedly. Yes. Marvin replied questioningly. I think so. It feels familiar. You were right. Izuku exclaimed, his mind beginning to run again. There are physical changes. Izuku put a hand to his lips and thought. The changes are rather dramatic, though. There's no way that isn't a quirk of some kind. The instant activation would make it a mutant type, but he looks like an average person, at least in my head. There's no visible change that would represent a mutant-type quirk. It could be an emitter. I am understanding roughly none of the words you're saying, Marvin told him, cutting Izuku's mumbling short. Oh. Well, a mutant-class quirk is a quirk that permanently physically changes an individual with it, usually giving them attributes related to their quirk, Izuku explained happily. Like dog ears or tails. Izuku went on to explain emitter, transformation, and mutant quirk classes in extreme detail, telling Marvin all the differences between them and bringing up pro heroes from his memories as examples. Somehow, the explanation was under 5 minutes, mostly because Izuku learned he didn't need to fully speak in his mind with Marvin. Just partially forming an idea would let Marvin understand what he meant. So, you're saying I might be a mutant, and that's normal? Marvin asked, slightly bewildered. We should find out if there are more changes, Izuku suggested. Mutant quirks often change people into partial animals. Your enhanced senses could be part of a bigger quirk. Marvin shrugged and turned to the truck they still stood next to. He put a hand against it and pushed sharply. The truck groaned as its tail end crumpled, the rest of it jerking forward as if hit by another vehicle. Marvin and Izuku did a double take, and Marvin stared at his hand in bewilderment. Okay, I know I can't do that, Izuku stated, a mix of surprise and excitement. So that has to be your quirk. I thought mutant quirks were animal-based? Izuku shook his head. Most are, but some aren't. Some just alter the physical appearance or abilities of a person. Try again. Marvin nodded and walked slowly towards the truck, gently cupping his hand under it and pulling up. The truck lifted with an almighty jolt and creak, and Marvin stared as he casually lifted the end of the truck over his head. I'm assuming this also isn't something you can do? Marvin asked sheepishly. Izuku stared. The casual display of strength reminded him of All Might crushing that fridge during his first day of training, and Izuku silently wondered if their quirks were similar. Eventually, he shook his head. No, I'm not sure what quirk you have, but at least we know you're strong. Marvin flicked his wrist and tossed the tail end of the truck into the pile of garbage, accidentally flipping the truck over and making it fold against the pile. I think you should have your body back, Marvin whispered, glancing around. I think people are staring. Izuku nodded and took control of his body again, and Marvin stepped back. Immediately, Izuku's senses dulled to that of an average human, and he winced slightly at the change. It feels like I went blind, Izuku said, looking around, noticing everything looked duller. Really? I don't see much difference besides how far you can see, Marvin replied, looking out the window. I can look out of your peripherals while you're looking another way. That seems useful. Izuku shook his head. We can journal this later. I need to finish cleaning up this garbage. He quickly set back to work, and Marvin stared on curiously. Why are you even doing this? I know it's for that all. All Might guy, weird name. Marvin shrugged it off. But I know it's for him, but why? Izuku gave a brief explanation about him being quirkless, about the bullying, about the discrimination, about the chance All Might had given him, and about how he needed his body to be prepared. This Kachugai. Kaken, Izuku corrected automatically as he worked. Right, that guy, Marvin replied. He told you to do what? Izuku cringed slightly. He didn't mean it, it's just how catch. Didn't mean it. Didn't mean it. Marvin screeched, which sounded odd with his deep voice. You don't joke about people fucking killing themselves. Marvin blinked, feeling an odd sort of anger rush over him, like some unknown floodgates had opened. The anger was dark and snarling, filled with jagged teeth and hatred, unlike anything either of them knew. It twisted and screamed something horrid, all-consuming like a deadly plague. Marvin snarled, balling his fists. That bastard! He roared. Izuku winced sharply, Marvin's rage reminding him of a scarier and louder Kaken. Marvin froze, his anger evaporating instantly like someone had sucker punched him in the gut. I didn't mean to. Marvin tried, feeling a sense of horror climb up him. I'm so sorry. Izuku smiled a bit sadly. It's alright. I can understand why you might be mad at him. Marvin felt a horrid sense of shame crawl up his skin, like vitriol up his throat, choking him with his own words. He isn't the best person, Izuku admitted. But we've been friends since childhood, even if we don't see eye to eye all the time. Friend. Marvin choked out in horror. He's your friend? He told you to kill yourself. Yeah, because I don't have a quirk, Izuku sighed, looking down and rubbing his neck. That's why I'm here. You're going to prove him wrong? Izuku nodded, holding up a fist. I'm going to prove him wrong and be just like All Might. Good, Marvin told him, feeling the horror pass. I don't know how long I'll be here, but I'll try to help you as I can. Deal? Deal. Izuku quickly set back to work, moving at twice his normal pace. The conversation had taken up a good chunk of time, and Izuku wanted to get done before All Might showed up. Marvin watched on mutely, his mind running wild. Why did he feel so ashamed? He was compared to this Kaken dude, almost subconsciously, and it almost immediately stopped the anger he felt. But why? What was so horrifying in his memories to stop that? And why shame? Why not shock? That was the more normal reaction, right? To feel shocked at being compared like that. Shame only came after. So what happened? Izuku finished his work as Marvin was lost in thought, screaming at the top of his lungs once he put the final mangled fridge onto the pile. All Might smiled as he approached, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride in the young man before him, and realized there truly wasn't anyone better for this power. He called Izuku down, watching the young man stumble over, sweat dripping across his body from the effort. Young Midoriya, All Might smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. You and your commitment to this training are impressive. I truly believe there is no better person to inherit my power. Izuku teared up, feeling his emotions begin to overwhelm him. Thank you, All Might, he choked out, feeling immense pride swell in his chest. All Might reached a hand to his head. I am simply telling you the truth, young Midoriya. You truly have the heart of a hero. It is with honor that I pass my power to you. He pulled a hair from his head and presented it to Izuku. Eat this. Izuku stopped, staring at the piece of hair in confusion and shock. What? All Might said, pushing the hair closer. That's the only way my quirk can be passed. You need to eat my DNA. What? Izuku exclaimed. This is too different than what I imagined. Eat it. All Might insisted. Come on. We don't have much time. The exam starts in a few hours. Eat. Izuku walked across the UA campus a few hours later, covering his mouth to hide the nausea. Ugh, who knew becoming a hero would taste so bad? Izuku muttered internally. Did it work? I don't feel any different. See, I would say the same, but there's a tunnel in your mind now. Izuku blinked. Huh? Really? He looked into his mind, seeing Marvin pointing to the back of the room, and turned, but saw nothing. Are you sure?" Izuku asked nervously. Marvin frowned. "You can't see it?" "I know it isn't really visible, but I can see it so clearly. Maybe it's the enhanced eyesight?" Izuku suggested. "How strong are your eyes anyway?" "Not entirely sure," Marvin admitted. "I know I have good eyes and ears. How good, though, I don't know." "Well, I suppose we can always learn." Izuku tripped forwards, his mental conversation leaving him distracted. He threw his hands out to catch himself, closing his eyes as he braced for impact. He waited a few moments, but nothing happened, and eventually, he opened his eyes again. Izuku was floating above the ground, almost buoyant in the air as if gravity didn't exist. "Are you all right?" a brown-haired girl asked, leaning beside him. She straightened him before touching her fingertips together, making Izuku drop to the floor softly. "Sorry, I didn't ask permission before using my quirk," the girl apologized with a kind yet nervous smile. "I just thought you wouldn't want to fall on your first day." Marvin took over, almost as an instinct rather than any real thought. "Thank you," he said, giving a small bow as he tried to remember what Izuku considered polite. "I'm Izuku Midoriya." The girl smiled. "𝐒𝐻𝐽𝑒𝐼𝐴, she replied. "Nice to meet you." "See you." She left quickly, leaving them standing on the campus. That felt weird, Marvin admitted as he gave back control to Izuku. "She seems familiar." Izuku's brows furrowed as he began walking again. "I thought you said you don't remember anyone." Marvin shook his head. "I don't, but it's just, the personality is giving me déjà vu. I think I've met someone like her before." Izuku frowned but shrugged it off as he entered the auditorium, feeling his nerves skyrocket at there being so many people. "They're all here to join Ue. I have to compete against all of them." "You'll be fine," Marvin said, looking around. "Isn't All Might like the best hero the world has ever seen or something like that? You're trained by him, you'll be fine." Izuku nodded shakily as he took a seat, trying not to act too nervous. Everyone else looked so calm, and Izuku silently questioned how they did it. "Oh my god, it's Present Mic," Izuku whispered excitedly. "Who?" Marvin asked. Izuku gave a quick explanation of the pro, telling Marvin that Present Mic was also a radio host. "Wait, so he's a teacher here, a pro hero, and a radio host?" Marvin asked, confused. "Doesn't that seem a bit excessive?" "Excessive is Present Mic's whole style," Izuku replied excitedly. Present Mic gave an explanation on the exam, telling the students they needed to defeat robots to gain points. Marvin shifted uncomfortably at Mic's explanation, feeling the sense of déjà vu again. He really needed to get his memories back. Not remembering stuff was killing him. They reached the area outside the testing site before they knew it, and Izuku's nerves were beginning to affect Marvin too. "Hey, you'll be fine," Marvin told him. "It's just a combat test, right?" "I don't know how to fight, though," Izuku admitted sheepishly. "I've never fought anyone before." Marvin blinked. "Really? No one at all?" Izuku shook his head. "No, nobody. I don't like fighting people." "Isn't that, like, the main thing about being a hero?" Marvin asked. "Fighting people?" "No, the most important thing is to help," Izuku replied with surprising conviction. "We fight to protect, not for fun." "Well, you'll need to fight here," Marvin told him as the last students lined up. "So you have to figure something out." Izuku blinked, a light bulb going off in his head. "Hey, Marvin." "Yeah. You said you have a lot of skills, right? Does one of them include fighting?" Marvin blinked. "It does actually." "Why? Want me to take over?" Izuku nodded shakily. Just for the test." Marvin took control, feeling the tight sensation return sharply. "You really need to get a growth spurt," he muttered internally. "Begin." Present Mic yelled, opening the gates. Marvin bit down a wince, his enhanced hearing betraying him for a moment. He shook it off and ran forward, or bounded forward more like passing dozens of students as he did. A robot came around the corner and Marvin spun on the spot, kicking its middle and ripping it in two. Marvin blinked as the robot collapsed, and distantly, he heard a soft ding. "Well, didn't think I could do that," he admitted before running off again. He saw two more robots and bounded forward, taking two massive leaps. Marvin twisted midair and a laser passed under him, missing him by hairs. He fell back, his head snapping to the left. A blond boy struck a pose as Marvin looked to him, his midsection covered by an odd belt. Excuse-moi, the boy said, winking. It wasn't my intention. Marvin rushed off without a word, fighting off the shiver of repulsion he got. Don't know who that is, hope he isn't in your class, Marvin told Izuku as he came around a corner. I just hope we don't run into 𝐭𝐽𝐲. Boo. Marvin hissed in pain and jumped back as another explosion ripped through the air. Izuku moaned in disappointment. Just my luck. Why did it have to be him? 𝗵𝘃𝗲 whipped around, his palms smoking as he stood surrounded by robot scrap. Oi! What do you think you're doing here, stupid 𝗧𝗪𝗓? He barked angrily. This is my exam. Didn't know he owned this, Marvin mumbled. Must have missed the memo. Oi! Do you hear me, 𝗧𝗪𝗓? 𝗵𝘃𝗲 yelled. This is my dream. Any plans for him? Marvin asked as 𝗵𝘃𝗲 scowled. Don't ignore me, stupid 𝗧𝗪𝗓. He roared, stalking over. I'm not going to let some quirkless nobody ignore me. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 let off an explosion and rocketed forward, hand outstretched. Marvin's eyes widened, and before he could stop, his body moved on its own. He leaned back and to the side, letting 𝗵𝘃𝗲's arm pass before he grabbed it. Marvin twisted the arm back and slammed his other hand on 𝗵𝘃𝗲's neck, shoving the boy to the ground. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 yelled as Marvin pushed the arm out, getting dangerously close to dislocating it. Marvin continued to push, his eyes cold and lifeless as 𝗵𝘃𝗲 yelled in pain. Marvin! Izuku snapped out of the lock, taking control and jumping back, away from 𝗵𝘃𝗲. Marvin gasped as he felt something like cold water mentally get dumped over him, coming to his senses. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 was panting on the ground, gingerly holding his strained arm as sweat poured down his forehead. What was that? Izuku yelled frantically, turning back to 𝗵𝘃𝗲. I don't know, Marvin stammered, holding his hands up. I just moved. Kakin, are you? I'm going to kill you. Marvin leaped away from another explosion, instinctively taking control. He jumped off a building and slid back, staying out of range. 𝗵𝘃𝗲's snarl was animalistic, and the two could swear that there was saliva frothing at the corner of his mouth. You. He snarled as he stood, explosions going off in his palms. I'm going to fucking kill you. Marvin dodged another explosion, kicking off a building as 𝗵𝘃𝗲 chased him. The explosion blew off part of the wall, and Marvin jumped back again as 𝗵𝘃𝗲 switched directions. I'm going to kill you. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 roared, missing another shot as Marvin dodged. I can't afford to hit him, Marvin said frantically as he leaped over 𝗵𝘃𝗲. I'm still not sure what I did back there. Stop moving, 𝗧𝗪𝗓. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 yelled after another explosion, twice as large as the ones before. He's getting angrier, Izuku pointed out nervously. Really? Marvin asked as leaped around a corner. I couldn't tell. Marvin came around the corner, back to where they'd started, and hear a ground-shaking rumbling. Even 𝗵𝘃𝗲 froze in his tracks as he saw a robot, twice the size of the buildings, bring itself up down the street. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 snapped over to Izuku and clicked his tongue. He didn't have time to waste on him, not now. We need to go. There's no way we're fighting that, Marvin said, to Izuku's nod. They turned and began running, only to stop as a scream ripped through the air. They turned, and their eyes widened as they saw a girl with familiar brown hair stuck under the rubble, right in the robot's path. Uraraka! Izuku yelled before he ran over. It was an instinctive takeover, something deep in him forcing him to help. Are you insane? Marvin yelled as Izuku bolted forward. We can't fight that thing. We have the power All Might gave me. Izuku replied. One for All filled his legs with power, and a deafening boom sounded as Izuku leaped. Izuku felt power rise in his arm, burning and painful, but he didn't care about pain right now. Remember what All Might said? His tracksuit tore open from the energy, revealing the red-hot lines of power coursing through his arm. Clench your butt cheeks. He was inches from the robot, its metal face before his. And from the bottom of your heart. His fist lashed out, the energy reached its peak, its heat unbearable. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Boo. The robot exploded with such force that it shook the buildings around them. Windows shattered and rubble soared into the air. The robot flew back, its metal warped and disfigured, and its body bursting as the energy of One for All tore through it like a bullet through aluminum foil. Izuku stared with wide eyes as the robot collapsed with an almighty thud, throwing up dust high into the air as it did. His right arm and legs flapped uselessly in the air, their bones completely shattered from One for All's power. Izuku began to fall, tumbling through the air at breakneck speeds. He pulled his uninjured arm back, mentally preparing to use All Might's power again. Izuku took a deep breath, closing his eyes as he clenched his fist. Smack! Izuku stopped midair, a familiar feeling of weightlessness overtaking his body. He opened his eyes, mostly out of shock, and saw Uraraka struggling to use her quirk. Release, she whimpered, her hands shaking. Izuku fell with a thud, thankfully landing on his uninjured arm with a grunt. Uraraka's face turned green, and in the next moment, her nausea caught up with her, making her vomit violently. Ugh, note to self, don't let you do any stupid ideas, Marvin groaned, somehow feeling the same pain Izuku did even when not in control. It was the only choice, Izuku groaned back, feeling a throbbing pain course through his muscles and bones. He felt a kiss on his head, and immediately, his body began healing with small snaps and cracks. Pretty useful quirk, Izuku yawned, feeling unbearable exhaustion wash over him like a wave. Hey, don't sleep, we might need to keep going, Marvin told him, fighting off the exhaustion better than Izuku was. He took control and stood shakily, his legs and arms heavier than his eyelids. His entire body felt sore, and once again, Marvin felt an intense sensation of déjà vu. Have to keep it going, Marvin yawned, swaying where he stood. Marvin took a single shaky step forward before his legs gave out and he collapsed again, succumbing to the exhaustion. Izuku walked home slowly, the sun low as he shuffled his feet. What was that? Marvin asked, echoing Izuku's thoughts. Izuku's body was still twitchy from earlier, and he felt a subconscious urge to activate One for All again, even if he knew it would hurt. I don't know, Izuku admitted. It looked like muscle memory. They were talking about Marvin's subconscious movements, in pinning down Bakugo, dodging that laser from the blonde boy, and kicking the robot in two, all before he could stop himself. What kind of muscle memory would have me do all that? Marvin asked, slightly concerned about what his memories might hold. Izuku shook his head. You were going to dislocate Kaken's shoulder. I didn't even realize I was doing it, Marvin mumbled, looking down. What was he? He wasn't a normal human, that was for sure. But what exactly was he? Being able to fight was one thing, but being able to catch someone midair and almost dislocate their shoulder without blinking, or dodging a point-blank laser while midair was another. Marvin felt dread pool in his metaphysical stomach, its groping hands crawling up his neck. What if he was some sort of freak? He asked himself, slightly panicked. What if he was a monster? Izuku froze as Marvin gasped in pain, the word bringing up a visceral reaction that knocked his breath out. It was something far more primal than what simple amnesia could erase. It felt like part of him, this reaction. Erasing it erased him. Marvin gasped, feeling something horrible crawl up his spine. His breath began to quicken, his eyes dilating and sweat dripping down his mental forehead. Marvin. Izuku dove into his mind. Marvin. Marvin was on his hands and knees in Izuku's mind, his head down as he stared at the ground and heaved. Izuku crouched beside him, trying to shake him out of the almost full-body shock he'd gone into. I'm not a monster. I'm not a monster. Marvin panted, his breath ragged and eyes unseeing. I'm not. Marvin. Izuku shook him again, trying to stop himself from panicking. Nobody could help them if he panicked. You're not a monster, Izuku told him, half frantic. You're not a monster. Marvin's breath quickened, his trembling becoming worse to even affect Izuku's physical body, making him collapse onto the sidewalk. I'm not a no. Marvin muttered, feeling something begin to snap. Marvin. Izuku cried, shaking him violently. Snap out of it. You're not a monster, okay? You're my friend. Marvin's vision went white, and suddenly, he wasn't breathing heavy anymore. He wasn't breathing at all. "You're not a monster, Marvin," a girl grinned at him. Marvin blinked. Was this a memory? He was standing in some sort of forest, filled with snow and dead trees as far as the eye could see. Bitter cold nipped at his fingers and face, as it did with the girl beside him. A beautiful brown-haired girl laughed, dark brown eyes shining. She looked older, with lines engraved deep in her face, almost as if carved there. Marvin was small? He felt tiny, even smaller than Izuku, and the trees looked like skyscrapers to his sight. The girl poked him in the forehead. "You're not a monster, you know? You're just a kid, a stupid one at that." The girl grinned again, messing with his hair affectionately. "A really stupid, dumb kid," the girl told him. "But I love you anyway." Marvin gasped as he was brought back violently, the memory snapping away like a rubber band. He was on his back in Izuku's mind, sweat pouring down his face and drenching his hair and clothes. His breath was ragged as he gulped down air like a drowning man, his heart pounding against his chest so hard Marvin thought it would rip from his ribcage. Izuku was kneeling next to him, sighing in relief as he realized Marvin was back. "Oh, thank goodness," Izuku let out a breath. "You're back." Marvin gave a shaky nod, his eyes almost unseeing. Who was that girl? Did she know him? Clearly she did if her teasing was anything to go by. But who is she? She felt familiar, and something deep inside him, something far beyond memories, ached agonizingly as he remembered her. Who? Who was that? Izuku asked softly. Marvin turned slightly to him. "You saw it?" he asked, voice hoarse. Izuku nodded. "Yeah, she looked like she loved you a lot." Marvin felt odd at that. Not at Izuku seeing his memories. Oh no, he'd seen Izuku's, so it was only fair. It was the fact that Izuku said the girl had loved him. That was the weird part. It felt foreign to him, as if something long forgotten, though that could be said for most things of his life at the moment. I'm not sure," Marvin whispered gently. "I can't remember." Izuku nodded and stood, helping him up with a hand. "She must have meant a lot to you," Izuku noted as he stood with his physical body. He blinked, noticing there were people surrounding him, whispering in concern. Hello." Izuku gave a sky wave, his nerves skyrocketing. "Hey kid, are you alright?" a man asked, stepping up. Izuku nodded shakily. "Why yeah, just..." Marvin took control. I just came back from the UA entrance exam. I think I may have overpushed my quirk a bit." Immediately, most of the crowd seemed to relax, understanding that UA's exam was one of the toughest in the country. Anyone would be wiped out after that. The man smiled. "Well, make sure to get your rest. We can't have heroes collapsing in our streets, now can we?" Izuku smiled back as the crowd dispersed, with the man patting him on the shoulder before leaving with another woman. Izuku eventually continued walking after collecting his bearings, feeling an odd sense of calm over him. Marvin was silent the entire walk home, simply staring at the floor of Izuku's mind without a word. Who is she? Did she really love him? That girl? Really? Him? It felt odd, like seeing the face of someone he'd known when he was young but couldn't quite remember, which, again, could probably be said for most in his life. But who is she? A friend? Sibling? Why her? What made her so important? Shouldn't it have been his parents to tell him that? Where were they? Marvin sighed silently, a part of him wishing to feel that pain again, just if it meant getting another memory. Izuku didn't speak to him until they were back home. It's not like he knew what to say anyway. How could you comfort someone like that? Someone who didn't even know who or where they were. If anything, it was surprising how well Marvin had taken everything. Thankfully, Marvin's silence only lasted until the next day, which broke the awkwardness somewhat. "Lighten up," Marvin grinned. "You're about to get your acceptance letter." Izuku smiled a bit. Marvin's grin was a bit tighter than normal, and his words felt rehearsed, but Izuku wouldn't push. Marvin would get better when he was ready. Instead, he nodded. "Well, I'm not sure if it's an acceptance. It could be a rejection." Marvin rolled his eyes. "You know, for the successor of the world's greatest hero, you're pretty damn pessimistic." Izuku sighed. "It's just... yeah." Marvin told him softly. "I get it, I think." Inko gave them their letter frantically, half shouting as her nerves went nearly as high as Izuku's. She gave him some privacy, but Marvin could see her shadow under the door, waiting for Izuku. Izuku stared at the letter, his shoulders shaking. This was it, the moment his future was sealed in. Well, it's not going to open by itself, Marvin urged him. Izuku grabbed the letter and tore it open, and watched a small metal disc fall onto his desk with a clatter. He and Marvin stared in confusion before the disc activated, showing a holographic video of All Might standing with a pinstriped yellow suit and classic smile. I am here as a holographic video. All Might grinned, his face oddly close to the camera. Huh. All Might looked off-screen to someone. Oh, sorry. He stepped back, letting the two see the screen behind All Might. All Might? This is from UA, right? Izuku looked back at his envelope, seeing the UA emblem. I didn't just come here to fight villains, All Might stated, seemingly knowing what Izuku was thinking. I'm actually here as UA's new faculty member. Both Izuku and Marvin did double takes, mentally exchanging a bewildered glance. Congratulations, young Midoriya. All Might cried, unperturbed, for your acceptance into UA High. Izuku felt like his grin had split his face open, and his joy became infectious, and Marvin grinned too. For your outstanding combat performance during the physical exam, you gained 15 combat points, All Might stated. That doesn't seem like a lot, Marvin muttered, more than a bit disappointed. You were going to gain more points, but due to there being an incident with another student, your points were docked, All Might continued, his smile slightly lower. Oh, Izuku and Marvin said simultaneously. However, All Might boomed, making them jump. Your act of bravery in saving a young woman from the 0-point robot, although it gained you no villain points. It gained you 60 rescue points. There were rescue points? Marvin asked, frowning. Izuku's brows furrowed. It would make sense. Heroes are supposed to help people too, not just fight villains. All Might's smile was back in full force. And therefore, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you into UA, young Midoriya. Izuku beamed again, crying out in shock and joy, laughing loudly. All Might extended his hand to the camera. Come, young Midoriya. This is your hero academia. Come and be the hero you're meant to be. All Might turned as someone spoke to him from off-screen, his smile faltering. I have to do how many of these? There was more soft chatter, and All Might suddenly looked embarrassed. Oh well, young Midoriya. All Might cleared his throat. Welcome to UA High. The video ended with a beep, and the disc sat at Izuku's desk as the hologram receded into it. Well, Marvin commented. At least you're in. Izuku nodded fervently as he jumped out of his seat. Izuku yelled as he barreled out of his room. He nearly tackled 𝐒𝐿 over, as the woman was pacing outside his door, but Marvin's quick reflexes made Izuku sidestep before they collided. Thanks, Izuku said, his excitement only slightly inhibited. Wow, Izuku, what is it? 𝐒𝐿 asked, grabbing his shoulders. Did you get in? Did you get into UA? Izuku nodded rapidly. I did. And guess what? All Might's going to be my teacher. Oh, that's wonderful. 𝐒𝐿 cried as she pulled him into a tight hug. I knew you could do it, Izuku. Izuku hugged her back and picked her up, spinning her around with a laugh. 𝐒𝐿 yelped then laughed, feeling unbridled joy at Izuku's laughter. Okay, you can put me down now, Mr. Hero. 𝐒𝐿 laughed and Izuku complied. So, do you know what your hero name is going to be? She asked, stepping back. Izuku rubbed his neck. I haven't even gotten to UA yet, Mom. I just got accepted. 𝐒𝐿 grinned. Well, since All Might is going to be your teacher, do you think he'd appreciate the hero names you made up when you were little? Izuku turned beet red, his eyes widening. I think my junior would sound good, 𝐒𝐿 continued as she headed to the kitchen. Or would you pick Mini Might? Mom. Izuku groaned, covering his face. Marvin struggled to keep a straight face at Izuku's sputtering, not even daring to look Izuku in the eyes, lest he lose control and start laughing fully. Oh, relax, Izuku, 𝐒𝐿 smiled as she made dinner. I'm just teasing you. Now, can you get those vegetables out from the refrigerator, dear? Izuku nodded and quickly began helping his mother make dinner, though his excitement was still almost palpable. The night passed and the days seemed to blur together, until one day, Izuku was standing outside of UA's campus, his hands shaking as he held his book bag. Relax, Marvin told Izuku as they walked to UA's front entrance. You stress out too much. It's you. Izuku exclaimed. How can I not be nervous? Their feet thudded softly against the brick, but the sound seemed to echo in Izuku's ears. This was it. This was his dream. Right before his eyes. UA's halls seemed massive and looming, their windows enormous as they looked over the campus and surrounding city. Izuku's breath was quick and stuttery as he walked, his throat dry and his hands shaking. As much as he didn't want to admit it, Izuku's nerves were getting to Marvin too, making him glance around Izuku's peripherals cautiously. We'll be fine, Marvin told him, as much to reassure himself as Izuku. You've got the strongest man in the world at your side training you. Izuku nodded shakily. Why, yeah, you're right. Marvin smiled as Izuku walked a bit more firmly, his pace a small bit faster. He reached the Grand 1A door, which was easily 20 feet in height if not more, and was about as wide as Izuku was tall. Izuku gulped, feeling his fear return with a vengeance. Am I really ready for this? You'll never know if you don't try, Marvin replied automatically before blinking. Where did that come from? Izuku nodded anyway, resting his hand against the handle and taking a deep breath. I wonder if Kaken is here, Izuku wondered idly as he stared at the door. Hopefully not, Marvin replied. You think he's still angry from the exam? Kaken? Hopefully he isn't, Izuku said, shivering a little. Marvin frowned. Something deep in him heavily disliked the fear Izuku had of Bakugo, and he silently vowed to make Izuku get over it, no matter what. Izuku took a deep breath, steeling himself before yanking the door, which slid open surprisingly easily. Get your feet off of the desk. A strict-looking boy roared at an uncaring Bakugo, who had his feet on the desk. It is an insult to this institution and to the designers to have such lack of manners. The boy continued. Bakugo gave a sarcastic grin. Who shoved the stick up your ass? Get a grip. The strict-looking boy flushed violently, appearing close to bursting. How dare you? He roared, his face red. Bakugo made to reply but turned, noticing Izuku at the door. What are you doing here, Deku? He snarled. The strict boy turned on a dime, his back as straight as a ruler. He quickly walked over to Izuku, adjusted his glasses, and bowed. Greetings, I am from semi-private academy, the boy greeted, his voice the definition of formal. My name is Tenya Ida. Izuku did a double take but managed a half bow back. Izuku Midoriya, it's nice to meet you. Ida stood straight and bowed his head. I would like to apologize for my words at the entrance exam. I understand now that what I did was rude. Words? What did he say? Izuku's brows furrowed. He was the guy who told you to shut up when you were fanboying over Present Mic, remember? Marvin replied, dragging up the memory. Huh? It's not a problem, really, Izuku told Ida, rubbing his neck with a nervous smile. I'm not mad. I know I can go overboard when it comes to heroes. Thank you, Midoriya, Ida stated before suddenly looking away. Huh? Ida, what's wrong? Izuku asked. Midoriya, you knew there was something else to the exam, didn't you? Ida asked. He looked almost ashamed, which bewildered both Marvin and Izuku. You are better than me, Ida continued. A true hero is what you are. Izuku stammered, utterly confused. Thankfully, he was saved by Uraraka's timely arrival. Midoriya, you're here, she exclaimed with a bright smile. Izuku turned sharply, his face turning red at Uraraka's close proximity. Your punch was so cool, she continued happily, seeming unfazed as she made a punching motion. Well, Izuku struggled for words, his hands covering his head flailingly. Punch! Punch! She chanted as she made the motion. Well, thanks. Izuku rubbed his neck and looked away, shielding his eyes with his hand. I'm just glad you were all right. Uraraka stopped and beamed at him. Thanks. I'm happy I could help you too. That quirk of yours seems like it hurts. Oh. Well, Izuku laughed nervously. Why, yeah, it does. I may have used too much. But it was so cool, though. Uraraka exclaimed. I wish I had a quirk that cool. Just make things go boom with my punches. You were the girl making the robots float, correct? Ida butted in, looking over Izuku's shoulder. Uraraka nodded. Yep. My quirk allows me to turn off gravity, but I keep getting nauseous if I use it too much, though. It's a useful quirk in many areas, Ida noted. Very nice.
Thanks.
𝐒𝐽rarka beamed again. But I think your quirk was cooler. You just went whoosh and destroyed the robots like they were nothing. Their conversation was cut short by a loud slurping sound, and the three students froze. They turned slowly and saw what looked like a yellow caterpillar with a human face and long black hair slurping a juice box. Go somewhere else if you want to make friends, the caterpillar said in a tired voice. The three students recoiled with a shout before the caterpillar stood, unzipped the sleeping bag that made up its body, and a tall man stepped out. I'm Shoyuta Aizawa, your homeroom teacher, Aizawa greeted dully. Welcome to the hero course. Aizawa ignored the mixed looks of shock and horror on Izuku, Achako, and Ida's faces and turned to the rest of the class. For your first lesson, you'll be having a test. What? The entire class exclaimed at once. Aizawa pulled a blue gym uniform from his sleeping bag and showed it to them. Take one of these and meet me on the training grounds. Don't be late, he told them. Before they knew it, Izuku and Marvin were on the training grounds, changed into the gym uniform along with their classmates. You'll be going through a series of tests to bring out your strength, Aizawa told them. Try your hardest. Whoever comes in last place will be expelled. No questions asked. The class cried, feeling pits of dread in their stomach. Marvin frowned. He won't do that. The entrance exam was supposed to weed out the unfit. There's no point in doing it again. Besides, All Might would have told you if this was planned. You think so? Izuku asked, his nerves rising. Marvin nodded. Whoever would actually do this on the first day is either a horrible teacher or a fool, and this man strikes me as neither. Izuku breathed a sigh of relief but steeled himself. Just because he wouldn't get expelled didn't mean he wouldn't try. You want help? Marvin asked. Izuku hesitated. I'm not sure. I want to see what I can do without help. I might not always have you, you know. The first test will be a 50-meter race, Aizawa told the class, followed by a grip test, standing long jump, ball throw, and several flexibility and strength tests. I have an idea, Marvin said. How about I take over for stuff like the race and strength tests, and you do everything else? Izuku paused for a bit but nodded. That seems fair. That way we both can test ourselves. With that, Marvin lined up for the 50-meter race, putting his hands on the ground. Side note, all of Marvin's scores here will be multiplied by a factor of 28.08 in comparison to Izuku's canon scores, since his strength will be leaking over much more in this FIC. Thanks to Reaper for doing the math for me. The world slowed, blood rushed in his ears, and his heartbeat seemed to thrum through his body. His breathing changed, becoming slow and deep, his eyes dilating massively. Marvin rocketed from the start line, making the ground explode violently as he took off. Winds kicked up after him, and Marvin crossed the finish line so fast it tossed the camera, tracking them like a piece of tissue paper. The camera landed a few feet away, thankfully not broken as Marvin skidded to a stop, one knee raised high as he slowed. 0.25 seconds. The class let out a simultaneous shout of surprise at the machine's declaration, Ida and Bakugo being the loudest by far. Okay. Genuinely, I have no idea what just happened, Marvin stated. Izuku's mind was working overtime analyzing. The speed boost wasn't from One for All. Apart from them being completely fine, Izuku also knew Marvin hadn't touched the quirk. But that speed was more than half the speed of sound. No human could naturally move that fast. Would that be part of a quirk? Marvin asked as the class stared at him. I would have enhanced senses, strength, and speed. You sound like a vampire, Izuku told him, mind still running. Marvin wrinkled his nose. That sounds familiar, he muttered, feeling odd again. And not in a good way. Midoriya. Aizawa's voice snapped them out of their conversation. They looked up at the ragged-looking teacher, who had an unreadable expression on his face. You need to begin the second test, he told them, gesturing to where the rest of the class was doing the grip test.
Yes, sir.
Izuku exclaimed before rushing over to his classmates. Do you want me to do the second test too? Marvin asked as Izuku took a gripper from Ida. I'm not sure. They could get suspicious, Izuku replied, barely refraining from saying kaken instead of they. Marvin hummed. Well, One for All seems to be an overall enhancement quirk, from what you've told me about All Might and that punch in the exam. Those don't seem uncommon. But I was quirkless before, Izuku reminded him. I shouldn't have any quirk. Maybe you can say it came in late? Or it had to be trained. Marvin suggested. That blonde kid seems to have something to help support his quirk. Maybe you can say you had a quirk, but it was too dangerous for you to use? Midoriya. Izuku looked up, seeing Ida staring at him in concern. You've been staring at the device for a while now, Ida stated. Are you alright? You have used one of these before, correct? Yeah. Yeah, Izuku nodded. It's just been a while. Oh, well you should have said so. Ida exclaimed. Here, I'll show you. Ida explained how to use the gripper, demonstrating it and showing Izuku his score of 56 kilograms. Here, he said, handing it back to Izuku. Go on. Try it. Marvin and Izuku made a quick switch and Marvin grabbed the device, feeling his blood rushing in his ears again. He gripped it tightly, pulling it closer to his body to get more power in. Let's see, Midoriya, Aizawa told him as he approached. Marvin let it go with a grasp, swiping a bit of hair from his face as he handed the gripper to Aizawa. Tried my best, he said sincerely. The homeroom teacher paused as he took it, staring at the number for a few seconds before writing it down. What was the score, sensei? Uraraka asked as she tried to look over his shoulder. 1,488.24 kilograms, Aizawa replied without looking up. What? Those within earshot whipped their heads over, staring at Midoriya as if he'd grown into a 10-foot-tall goblin with 3 heads and a dragon tail. How are you that strong? Izuku asked, shocked. Marvin frowned. I'm not sure, but it feels natural. But weird, it's weird. I think I was stronger, but I can't be sure. Your quirk is really strong, isn't it? Uraraka asked from beside him. Izuku jumped, not having noticed her there. Yeah, it is. Izuku rubbed his neck and looked away, avoiding her eyes. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄𝐻 sked from where he was, standing beside Kirishima and a few others. Stupid Deku doesn't have a quirk, he muttered, crossing his arms. Kirishima turned to him, brows furrowed. Doesn't have a quirk? Dude, are you serious? He asked 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄. You saw that punch in the entrance exam, and he crossed those 50 meters in less than a second. There's no way he's quirkless. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄 snarled but didn't respond as they continued with the tests. Deku had changed. Apart from the physical changes, he'd gotten stronger. Too strong and faster. He'd dodged 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄's blasts with ease back at the entrance exam and had even outrun him. His snarl deepened. There was no way that stupid Deku could punch a robot that size into scrap, no matter how much training he did. That had to be quirk-related. Eventually, they moved on to the ball throw, and 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄 was itching to prove how inferior Deku was to him. He may have been beaten in the first few, but here was his time to shine. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄 Katsuki. Aizawa intoned dully, tossing the ball to the blonde. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄 grinned as he caught the ball, his heart pumping louder with anticipation. He took a stance and charged up his quirk, rearing back his arm. Die. Boo. The ball roared into the sky like a missile, and the class gasped in awe as it flew away. 705.2 meters, the robotic voice from Aizawa's device said. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄 grinned. Beat that, losers. Hey, we're not losers, Kaminari protested, though he quickly caved as 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄 turned to him. Sorry. Uraraka was up next, and she tossed the ball high into the sky with her quirk. The class waited for the ball to come down, with Uraraka getting slightly nervous as the time passed. Infinity, the robot voice declared. Uraraka laughed nervously, rubbing her head. Oops. Now that's a pro score, Kirishima exclaimed, making 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗄𝗄 snarl. Next up was Marvin, who Izuku had given permission to use one for all. I'm not sure what it'll do, Marvin admitted as he caught the ball. One for all seems pretty damn powerful. Maybe you can use it more? Izuku suggested. One for all breaks you, right? Marvin asked, getting a nod. Then we should try to minimize the damage. We don't know what tests are up. You could need that arm. Izuku nodded. You're right. We have to be careful. Something wrong, Midoriya? Aizawa asked. Just use your quirk to throw the ball. That's the thing, sensei, Marvin replied nervously. Well, my quirk can break my body if I'm not careful, and I don't want to break my arm in case I need it. Aizawa's eyes narrowed. A hero with a one-use quirk isn't a good hero, Midoriya. Figure it out, or you make it far in this course. Marvin bristled at the comment but nodded, getting into position and drawing back his arm. What if I just use my finger? He asked, activating One for All. Izuku nodded. Good idea. It'll minimize the damage. Marvin concentrated One for All on his finger, hoping not to go overboard. It felt like fire, but in a good way. The way the power moved felt almost alive, twisting through his hand and finger as if eager to be used. Marvin took a deep breath and launched the ball with all his force. The ball exploded out of his hand, making a sonic boom as it flew with the force of a railgun bullet. The class's eyes went wide once again, and 𝗵𝗃𝗲 was positively frothing at the mouth in rage. 4,951.2 meters, the voice declared. Marvin's hand trembled, the finger halfway broken but still functional, his arm and wrist aching painfully. He raised his hand towards Aizawa, showing him the broken finger, and grinned. I'm still fine, I can still move, he stated, voice shaky. Okay, so that theory was wrong, Marvin groaned painfully. If anything, the damage is worse. Aizawa smiled at the teen's actions. This kid. Deku, you bastard. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 roared, shoving through the class with his explosions. Tell me how you did that, you stupid. 𝗵𝗃𝗲's yell cut off as cloth wrapped around his body, pulling his limbs and face back harshly. Stand with the class, 𝗵𝗃𝗲, Aizawa barked. His eyes glowed red, his hair flying around his head as he pulled on his capture weapon, the scarf he had been wearing. Izuku's eyes widened as he recognized the red eyes. That's Eraserhead, he exclaimed excitedly. He can erase quirks just by looking at people. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 struggled against the capture weapon, pulling against it but unable to even budge it. What is this thing? He asked, failing to break free. Steel alloy and carbon fiber cloth, Aizawa replied, pulling it tighter. Now get back in line, I hate having to use my quirk so much. It gives me dry eye. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 strained against the scarf once again, failing for the third time to break out of it, and eventually conceded. Aizawa let him go, closing his eyes with a sigh as he pulled the scarf back. Izuku quickly shuffled to the rest of the class, holding his still broken finger. Are you alright? Ida asked. Izuku nodded. Why yeah, just a small break. It'll be fine. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 snarled at him, barely restraining explosions in his palms. Izuku shrunk back as he caught 𝗵𝗃𝗲's eye, feeling an old fear shoot through his body again. Unfortunately, when in fear, the body's response is to produce adrenaline. Marvin's eyes went blank, becoming lifeless and cold as he subconsciously took over Izuku's body. Izuku's body stood straight, and dead eyes stared right into 𝗵𝗃𝗲, all signs of fear gone. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 did a double take, feeling as if something had pressed his lungs flat. He snarled again. He hated feeling scared or weak, and currently Izuku was making him feel both. I'm going to kill you, he roared, exploding over to Marvin. 𝗵𝗃𝗲. No. Aizawa's eyes shot open, quirk active. The blonde's explosions cut off mid-blast, leaving the boy still flying through the air. Marvin moved on instinct, and a whip-like crack rang out as his kick connected to 𝗵𝗃𝗲's jaw. He twisted, jumping off one foot and hit 𝗵𝗃𝗲 again before the boy could process anything. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 flew back, tumbling on the ground before rolling to a stop. Marvin lunged forward, fist raised and eyes still empty. Midoriya, Aizawa barked, launching his capture weapon. Marvin turned on a dime, shooting to the side and completely dodging the scarf. But the shout snapped him out of his dead state, and Marvin stumbled as he stopped. He blinked, staring at his hands before looking up and seeing 𝗵𝗃𝗲 on the floor. I did that, Marvin asked, shocked. You don't remember? Izuku's brows furrowed. You hit Kaken twice before I could stop you, and it was you dodging Aizawa-sensei's capture weapon that brought you back. Marvin frowned. But I still don't know how I did it the last time. Aizawa stared at them, quirk off, his face unreadable. That wasn't a quirk. I know I deactivated it, he thought. Those kicks and that dodge was Midoriya's body, not his quirk. But that was impossible. Midoriya had hit 𝗵𝗃𝗲 twice in less than a second, and had dodged his capture weapon point blank, seemingly with ease too. There wasn't a human on Earth that could move that fast without a quirk or some technological help. I need to bring this up with Nizu, the pro told himself. This happened in the entrance exam too. Clearly these two have history. He quickly took care of the class, pushing them through the last few tests without much comment. Bakugo's scowl seemed etched on his face even as the tests ended, but fortunately, he said nothing else. At the end, Aizawa showed the results, and Izuku flushed at seeing himself in second place, just behind Momo Urozu. Good news, you all. Passed, Aizawa said dully, and then, as almost an afterthought. And none of you are getting expelled. What? Almost all the class cried. Aizawa grinned at them. It was a logical ruse to bring out your full potential. So we weren't in any danger? Uraraka mumbled, feeling relieved. Well, think of it this way, Izuku told her. There's no way we would spend so much time trying to get in only to get kicked out right after. It'd be a waste of time. Momo turned and gave him a small smile, having said something similar to Kaminari and Kirishima. Izuku flushed but managed to give a tentative smile back. The day ended with Izuku leaving Recovery Girl's office. His finger healed but bandaged, walking slowly as he left UA's grounds. He stopped as he felt a hand on his shoulder and turned, seeing Ida standing there, as professional as ever. Is your finger okay, Midoriya? He asked. Izuku smiled, nodded and showed his finger. Yep, thanks to Recovery Girl. Ida gave a small smile back. Good, we can't have you being injured constantly. It's unbecoming to a pro. Well, we're not really pros yet, Izuku muttered, rubbing his neck. We don't even have our licenses yet. It's only a matter of time. Ida declared as they began walking together. Someone of your caliber surely wouldn't take long to become a pro hero. Izuku flushed and bowed his head, muttering a soft thanks in response. He still wasn't good with compliments. But I can't believe Aizawa-sensei would push us forward with a lie, Ida said, shaking his head. That's so unheroic. And maybe it was to simulate real life? Izuku suggested as they walked. Ida looked at him curiously. What do you mean by that? Oh, because we ma. Hey, you two. Going to the station. Izuku and Ida turned, seeing Uraraka running over to them, waving. Wait for me. She yelled, and the two complied, stopping until she reached them. Hi. I'm Achako Uraraka. She introduced herself to Ida with a wave. I'm Tenya Ida. Ida replied with a small bow, hand on his chest. Nice to meet you. Uraraka turned to Izuku. How's your finger, Deku? Izuku did a double take. I'm not. He flushed again, and bowed his head. I'm not Deku. Oh, I'm so sorry. Uraraka exclaimed quickly. I just thought that, that Bakugo guy called you that. I thought it was like a nickname or something. No, it's alright, Izuku rubbed his head. Izuku's my real name, but Kaken sometimes calls me Deku to make fun of me. I'm sorry. Uraraka repeated, thoroughly embarrassed at having accidentally insulted him. But I kind of like it, She told him, making him look up. Huh? Like it? Izuku asked, feeling dread pool in his stomach. Was he going to be known as Deku here too? After so many years of wanting to escape the name, would it haunt him here? In the middle of his dream? Well, it kind of sounds like Dikaru, or I can do it, Uraraka explained quickly, not wanting to be taken the wrong way. So I like it, I'm Dikaru. Izuku exclaimed, flushing. Ida stared at him. I thought you said it was an insult? Izuku flushed more and turned away, covering his face. It's like a Copernican revolution, he muttered in embarrassment. Kopi? Uraraka asked, head tilted. Eventually, the trio began walking again, engaging in vivid conversation on their way to the station. Izuku smiled both internally and externally as Ida explained something about hero work to them. This was it. He finally had friends. He had Marvin, Ida, and Uraraka with him. He wasn't alone anymore. He glanced back to where he knew UA was and smiled more. His dream was really coming true. He was going to be a hero. What is this? Marvin asked as Izuku changed into his hero costume. My hero costume, Izuku replied, pulling on his gloves. It looks like a onesie, Marvin said, momentarily taking control of Izuku's arm and picking at the outfit. Izuku flushed. It was inspired by All Might. I wanted to be like him growing up. Marvin snorted. Yeah, no kidding. Think he can copyright you for this thing. He knocked the respirator with his knuckles, frowning slightly. You know, this entire thing is really impractical, he told Izuku. Hardly anything here supports you. You should have gone for some bracers to help you with One for All or something. Well, this was designed before I got All Might's power. Izuku rubbed his neck embarrassedly. And my mom made it. I couldn't say no, now could I? It'd be ungrateful. Marvin stared at him, feeling something odd stir in his chest. He shook it off, continuing to check the costume for faults, of which it had plenty. You couldn't have added anything more sturdy than cloth? He asked. One good hit from a villain with a slightly destructive quirk and your costume is ruined. Izuku frowned. I didn't think of that. You think the costume department will still accept changes? He replied as they walked. They better. There's no way you can do hero work in what's essentially a Halloween costume. No offense, Marvin answered, picking at the gloves. What are we doing today anyway? Combat training, Izuku explained. All Might said it's to improve our awareness. Marvin nodded. Good. Power means nothing if you don't know how to use it. You could benefit from some hand-to-hand work though, since that seems like what your quirk 𝐕𝐴. Izuku looked up and froze as Uraraka walked up to him in her hero outfit. Uraraka, your hero outfit. It's Izuku stammered, looking away as he flushed. Uraraka rubbed her neck in embarrassment. Yeah, they made it a bit too tight for my liking. You could complain to the costume department about that. The two turned, seeing Momo walk up to them calmly. Izuku flushed again, looking away from Momo quickly. Whereas Uraraka's outfit was simply tight, Momo's was tight and revealing, having a huge gash down the front that exposed her stomach and part of her breasts. Even Uraraka flushed slightly. The outfit hardly looked practical for extended combat, not that she could talk, given that she was wearing knee-high boots with heels. Yamamomo, that's your hero costume? She asked. It looks, Momo sighed. I know. Unfortunately, it's needed for my quirk. If I don't have skin exposed, then any material I create will rip through my clothing, and the situation will be worse. Izuku paused, his mind running circles at that. Then wouldn't a big hole on your back be more appropriate? Marvin asked, voicing Izuku's thoughts. It would expose skin still, but wouldn't have the chance of accidentally being too revealing. Momo blinked, and for a second, had nothing to say. I didn't think of that, Momo admitted, flushing. Thank you for that, Midoriya. All right. Everyone gather around me. All Might's voice broke them from their conversation. The class obliged, and Marvin looked around as Izuku paid rapt attention to the #1 hero. Do absolutely none of these people know how to dress? He muttered lowly as he saw Todoroki's costume, which was literally a white jumpsuit with one side frozen over. He wasn't a fashionista by any means, judging by the fact that his mental avatar in Izuku's head just wore a t-shirt and jeans. But come on, there had to be better style choices than whatever the hell it was that Mineta wore. Hey! Izuku's voice snapped him out of his thoughts, and he blinked. They were walking into a sort of mock city, the same one in which they'd taken the entrance exam. What's going on? He asked, looking around. It's a simulation trial, Izuku explained. A pair of heroes versus a pair of villains. Me and Yaoyorozu were paired together. Heroes? Marvin asked, and Izuku shook his head. We're the villains, Izuku told him as they entered the building. So we were given time to plan. They reached the room with the bomb and didn't have to wait long for Momo to show up, looking around the room as she entered. What's the plan, Midoriya? She asked, looking at him. Why me? Izuku stammered, pointing to himself. Momo gave him a curious look. Of course, I saw how you handled Bakugo the other day when he attacked you. You clearly know what you're doing. Oh, Izuku looked away, flushing. Are you all right, Midoriya? Momo asked, slightly concerned. Yes, sorry, Marvin said, taking control. Momo was taken aback slightly at the sudden shift. Midoriya had lost all sense of embarrassment, his eyes cold and calculating, which gave him a slightly intimidating look. What's your quirk again? Marvin asked. You can create things, right? Momo nodded. I can create any non-living material from the lipids on my body as long as I know its atomic structure. How quickly can you make big objects? Momo made a "oh-so" gesture. A few minutes, if I know what to make. Izuku took over, his analytical brain overriding his embarrassment for the moment. We need to lay a trap, he muttered. Kaken's too proud not to attack me, so I have to go out and fight him. That means you have to stay here to protect the bomb and deal with 𝐒𝐬𝐽. Do you know what her quirk does? Momo asked. I know she mentioned something about gravity, but I don't remember the specifics. She can turn off the gravity of anything she touches, Izuku replied, still muttering. Which makes her a close-range fighter. Something to keep her away would nullify her quirk, or something to restrict her movement. I can make a trap to stop her once she enters, Momo stated. That way her quirk isn't a problem. I can also use a staff to fight. But what about Bakugo? Izuku paused for a moment. He's an aggressive fighter, and uses his explosions to maneuver. Something to restrict his hands would work, but it would probably get blasted off. I would either need something to turn off his quirk, like Aizawa-sensei's erasure, or beat him in a fight. Are you sure that's safe? Momo asked, a bit worried. Aizawa-sensei had to restrain him twice during the quirk apprehension test. I'm not too confident in it, Izuku admitted nervously, rubbing his neck. But I need to fight him. I'm the only one who knows how his quirk works. Momo stared at him oddly, her head slightly tilted. Her expression was unreadable, but if Izuku had to guess, it looked vaguely concerned. You two have history, she stated more than asked. Izuku flushed and looked away. He used to bully me a lot when we were kids. For things I couldn't control. Oh, I'm so sorry, Midoriya, Momo apologized. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's fine, Izuku tried to wave it off. I've gotten over it now, I think. All Might called the exercise to start, and Momo stayed behind with the bomb, while Izuku went out, trying to calm his nerves. You'll be alright, Marvin told him. Bakugo seems like the type to talk loud but not actually don't anything. He thinks he's strong because he has a flashy quirk. For some inexplicable reason, Marvin absolutely loathed Bakugo. Even if he didn't know what he'd done to Izuku, he still would have disliked him. It was this nagging feeling whenever he saw the blonde, something he couldn't shake off. Surely enough, it hadn't even been a minute when Izuku heard explosions down the hall. Izuku steeled his nerves, taking a deep breath as Bakugo exploded around the corner. Deku, he snarled, almost animal-like. Izuku subconsciously took a step back. There was something different about Bakugo, something far more dangerous. Bakugo exploded forward, and Izuku barely managed to leap into an adjacent hallway in time. He kicked up right before an explosion hit him, singing his shoes as he jumped back. "W.O. Kaken." Izuku yelled as he jumped back again. This is just a test. Bakugo snarled again, and Izuku barely dodged as the blonde leaped, hitting the wall with an explosion. Shut up! Bakugo roared, letting off another explosion. Izuku dodged and ran into another hall, quickly trying to get a plan while berating himself for not asking Momo for tools. Get back here, you quirkless bastard, Bakugo yelled, giving chase. I'm going to fucking kill you. Izuku jumped into a room, dodging an explosion that filled the hallway. He stood again, seeing Bakugo stalk in slowly, his breath heavy and eyes crazed. You fucking lied, Bakugo snarled, explosions going off in his palms. What the heck are you talking about, Kaken? Izuku yelled, adopting a fighting stance. I never lied about anything. Bakugo scowled and rushed forward. Liar. He sent off another explosion, but Izuku moved, grabbing his arm and flipping him onto the floor. Izuku jumped back and stared, breathing heavily as his nerves reached an all-time high. You always start with a right hook. He yelled. I've watched you, Kaken. I know how you fight. Bakugo stood slowly, his head down. So you've watched me? He asked, his voice odd. Kaken. Izuku asked, backing away. What are you? Marvin leapt to the side as Bakugo released an explosion, but his right arm still got burned. I knew it. Bakugo stared at him, his eyes crazed. I fucking knew it. Izuku stepped back, swallowing. Knew what, Kaken? You are just a loser, Bakugo yelled. You've watched me because you have nothing better to do, right? You're just a quirkless loser, aren't you? Izuku balled his fists. I'm not a loser, he roared. And I'm not quirkless. I'm going to be the world's greatest hero, just like All Might. Bakugo actually looked taken aback for a moment, staring at him with a mix of shock and amusement. A small laugh escaped him. You. He pointed. You. Izuku tightened his jaw as Bakugo's laugh grew into a chuckle. You. Bakugo asked again, his voice oddly high-pitched. You're going to be a hero? Izuku nodded firmly. That's right. I'm going to be the best hero the world's Eve. He trailed off as Bakugo began laughing, full-on belly laughing at Izuku's words. Tears rolled down his face, and Bakugo's hands went to his stomach. Stop laughing, Izuku yelled, balling his fists again. Just watch. I'm going to be a better hero than you'll ever be. Bakugo stopped, his laughter dying immediately as he stood straight. Izuku stepped back. The words had come out before he could even process them. 𝐒𝐽𝐽𝐽𝐻𝗭𝐴. Bakugo scowled. Really? You'll have to make it out of here fucking alive first, he growled. He raised his arm, pointing the grenade-shaped bracer he wore at Izuku, his other hand grabbing the pin. Young Bakugo. All Might's voice came through the intercom. What are you doing? It's alright, Bakugo grinned maniacally. He said he's going to be the best, right? Then he can survive this. He pulled the pin, and an explosion the size of the room roared out, enveloping Izuku's body in a second. The explosion blew out the wall with a boom, and tremors shook throughout the building. Upstairs, the capture weapon Momo had made broke from the shaking, and Uraraka broke out, leaping at Momo with her hands outstretched. Momo tried to dodge but got caught in the side, and felt her gravity disappear as Uraraka activated her quirk. Back downstairs, Bakugo was laughing maniacally, dangerous glee coursing through him as he saw the thick smoke that covered where Izuku's body was. How's that for a hero? He shouted. You like that, you stupid quirkless bastard. He laughed again, seemingly gleeful at the lack of response. A cough came from the smoke and Bakugo froze, his laughter dying. Izuku walked out of the smoke, his shoes smacking the ground with a soft thud, and rubble crunching under his feet. Bakugo stepped back, hands shaking. Whoever the fuck that was, it wasn't Deku. Oh, the body was the same, but the eyes. They looked dead, more than dead. Colder than ice and dangerously calculating. And for the first time in a long while, Bakugo looked at Deku. And Bakugo felt fear. Marvin turned to him, and Bakugo stepped away again, raising his gauntlet. Fine. I'll do it, Aga. Marvin's punch to the gut cut him off, and Bakugo went flying into a wall. His back had barely crashed against it when Marvin rushed him, punching him through the wall. Marvin grabbed Bakugo by the ankle as the boy flew out the building and pulled. He slammed Bakugo on the ground hard enough to make the boy bounce, spit flying from the blonde's mouth. Marvin kicked him as he bounced, and the sickening sound of bones cracking could be heard as Bakugo went flying again. Bakugo coughed violently as he rolled to a stop, his head spinning. Marvin landed on him with both feet, making him scream as his stomach essentially flattened. The floor cracked from the force, and Bakugo felt consciousness begin to fade from him. Marvin pummeled his face, the sound of the blows resembling gunshots as he wailed the boy. He grabbed Bakugo's collar and pulled, tossing the boy into the air like a rag doll. Marvin kicked Bakugo in the jaw, sending him flying again and tumbling into the opposite wall. He waved a hand, and Bakugo screamed as a rush of fear hit his body like a semi-truck. It was unbridled, horror-filled fear, and consciousness slammed into Bakugo again, though he wished it hadn't. Marvin rushed him again, and Bakugo barely dodged with an explosion, his heart pounding in his throat. More wall crumbled as Marvin's fist went through it, and Bakugo felt the rubble cut his skin. Marvin switched directions mid-air and leaped, kneeing Bakugo in the side and breaking the rest of his ribs. Bakugo hit the ground with a thud, his pain receptors flaring as tears stung his eyes. Bakugo rolled to a stop, coughing up what suspiciously seemed like blood. His eyes widened as Marvin appeared above him, leg raised high. A haphazard explosion went off, pushing Bakugo away as Marvin brought his leg down right where his head had been. The floor exploded from the force, crumbling and collapsing as his strain finally broke it. The two boys fell through the floor, and 𝗵𝗃𝗲 screamed as he felt it give way. Unfortunately, the two collapsed walls and the collapsed floor destabilized the building, and it began to collapse with a rumble. "Marvin, Momo and Uraraka are going to die," Izuku yelled, finally breaking through the haze. Marvin snapped out of it. Everything slowed, and he looked around for a second. He darted to the right, grabbing 𝗵𝗃𝗲 and scooping him up mid-air before darting off again. He pushed himself to move faster, wanting nothing more than to save the girls. He couldn't let them die, he wouldn't let them die. Come on, he urged himself to move faster as the building collapsed around him. Green lightning began to swirl around them, and Marvin felt a rush of power pour through his veins. One for all, they both realized. They took off, breaking the sound barrier several times over as they rushed upstairs. Marvin and Izuku reached the room where the bomb was, seeing Momo and Uraraka in slow motion, falling through the floor. Izuku rushed forward, grabbing Uraraka, who was the closest, and her capture tape. Marvin tied a knot between her and 𝗵𝗃𝗲 and threw them out a nearby window before rushing over to Momo. Izuku pulled the rubble away and leaped down. He grabbed her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her in tightly. Marvin rushed out, leaping out the window he'd thrown 𝗵𝗃𝗲 and Uraraka out of. Izuku grabbed the three and twisted so he was at the bottom. Momo still held closely to him. Time snapped back into normal speed, and the four began falling at high speed. Momo and Uraraka screamed as their surroundings suddenly changed, before it rose in pitch as they realized they were falling. "Uraraka gravity!" Izuku yelled. "Momo!" The two girls froze, their brains scrambling to process anything through the panic. They were only a few feet from the ground, and Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the worst. A boom came from their left, and in the next moment, All Might carried the four through the air in his massive arms. "Young Midoriya!" He boomed as he caught them. Izuku did a double take, but felt relief spread through his body as they landed safely. All Might set them down gently, his face gravely worried and concerned. "Are you four all right?" he asked, kneeling next to them. Izuku spoke for them, and nodded shakily. "Why yeah, thanks All Might." Momo flushed violently. Midoriya?" She half asked, half squeaked. Could you remove your arm, please?" Izuku shouted as he pulled his arm back, which had still been tied around Momo's waist from when he caught her. "I'm so sorry," Izuku stammered, his face redder than ever before as he moved his hands wildly. I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Momo replied, rubbing her arm and not looking him in the eye. "Dekura," Uraraka squeaked. "Your costume." Izuku looked down, seeing that most of the upper part of his costume was destroyed save for a single glove, exposing his torso and chest. His pants were also heavily burned but thankfully, still mostly intact. Izuku flushed horribly and tried to cover himself. Sorry, it's just that Kaken, he yelled, suddenly remembering the blonde. He whipped his head over, seeing 𝗵𝗃𝗲 up laying on the floor, heavily injured, with All Might kneeling over him. "He's too injured to move," All Might declared, putting a finger to his ear. "Shota, we need recovery girl here now." The school nurse arrived quickly with a bag of medical supplies, because when the world's greatest hero demanded urgency, he got urgency. Recovery girl quickly went to work with her quirk as the other three were moved from the site, given they could still move without much pain. They arrived at where the class was, all of whom were silent, though they stared quite heavily. More teachers were there. Apart from Eraserhead, Midnight, Present Mike, and a small white rodent wearing a suit were all there. "What was that?" Izuku asked quietly, staring at the ground. "I don't know," Marvin replied just as quiet. "I really don't." Izuku felt anger boil up in him. "What do you mean you don't know?" he demanded angrily. "It's your body." Marvin shot him a glare. "In case you've fucking forgotten, I can barely remember my fucking name." "You're lying," Izuku yelled back, tears welling up despite himself. "You can see my memories." Marvin reminded him angrily. "You think I fucking want this? You think I want to be some fucking freak who can go off and nearly fucking kill people like I'm some fucking sleeper agent?" He punched a mental wall. All I want to do is fucking go home. But I don't even remember if I have a home, let alone one to go to. Tears were rolling down his face now, even as Marvin angrily wiped them away. He sat in a corner of Izuku's mind, knees drawn up. I just want to know who I am, man. I want my family. I want my normal body, he whispered, but Izuku heard him loud and clear. I want her, whoever she is. Izuku didn't respond. He didn't know how to. He wanted to. He wanted to yell about how Marvin's violence could be counted as a crime and possibly get him kicked from UA or even arrested. But for some reason, he couldn't. Seeing Marvin's response to it, which was usually always panic or sometimes even fear, he just couldn't. Instead, he felt bad for him. Izuku may not have had a quirk for most of his life, but at least he didn't have to deal with a personality crisis over not even remembering most of his life. Midoriya? Midoriya, are you okay? Izuku looked up and Momo's concerned face came into view, her brows furrowed somewhat cutely, which was an odd thought given the current circumstances. Well, yeah. He replied automatically before he touched his face. His fingers came back wet, and Izuku brushed away his tears, trying not to stare into Momo's eyes too long. Something about them made him feel odd. Momo put a hand on his shoulder, her eyes darting over his body for a quick second. We're here for you, Midoriya, Momo said softly. Me, Uraraka, and the rest of the class. Izuku looked at her and gave her a soft smile. Thanks, Moyorozu, sorry. Momo paused, both at his smile and at the near slip-up, and smiled back. It's all right, you can call me Momo if you feel more comfortable that way, she told him, feeling odd. Or Yamamomo if you prefer. I've heard Uraraka call me that once or twice. Izuku tore his eyes from her lips, flushing a bit, and nodded. Thanks. And Momo. No problem, Midoriya, Momo replied. See, call me Izuku mumbled, flushing brightly. Or Dikaru if you like. Izuku then, Momo smiled. Momo realized she still had her hand on Izuku's shoulder and snapped it back, muttering an apology as she did. Mr. Midoriya? A squeaky voice came from behind him. Izuku and Momo turned, seeing the white rodent-like creature staring up at him. Yes. Izuku asked before quickly adding, Sir? I'm Principal 𝗍𝗍, said calmly. May you come with me, please? You too, Miss Uraraka. The two teens followed the principal nervously, exchanging a glance between them. They relaxed somewhat as they entered the medical ward, seeing Uraraka somehow already there, sitting on a bed, her arm and wrist bandaged. Recovery girl rushed over to them, checking them for injuries. Izuku had severe burns across his torso, right arm and leg, along with minor scratches and a bit of bruising on his knuckles from when Marvin had punched through the wall. Momo was better off, only some mild cuts and bruising on her legs from when she fell through the floor. 𝗍𝗍 waited patiently as recovery girl worked on the students, hands behind his back. He watched Midoriya keenly, confusion raising itself in his mind as he watched the boy become flushed and nervous at being treated. 𝗍𝗍 hummed softly and thought. Midoriya seemed to switch between a highly capable fighter who had enough potential to kill, to a shy and nervous teenager that was awfully polite and sometimes even meek. The principal clicked his tongue. He had no evidence of mind control or manipulation, but Toshinori hadn't reported anything similar during their training over the summer. 𝗍𝗍 turned to where Bakugo was lying, unconscious and heavily bandaged. According to recovery girl, the young man had all of his ribs broken, most of them severely, along with a severe concussion, organ bruising, and severe external cuts and bruises. If 𝗍𝗍 was being perfectly fair, he thought the boy deserved it somewhat. Bakugo had gone out of his way 4 times to start a confrontation with Izuku Midoriya, even when Midoriya actively avoided a confrontation. But the damage done was severe. 𝗍𝗍 wouldn't be surprised if the boy needed care for the next few weeks, even with healing quirks and their technology. On the other hand, Bakugo seemed to have a history with Midoriya. The incessant bullying and threats, along with the clear disregard for Midoriya's life or safety, even when Midoriya clearly showed worry for Bakugo, painted a very ugly picture. 𝗍𝗍 turned back to Izuku and Momo, deciding to hold his thoughts until later. He needed to get more information before making a decision. Well, I suppose you two are healed up. 𝗍𝗍 put on a fake cheerfulness, but underneath his mind was running. Momo nodded. Yes, sir. Recovery girl healed our injuries. 𝗎𝗎 turned to Izuku. And you, Mr. Midoriya? How are you feeling? Izuku gulped as 𝗎𝗎 turned to him. Something about the cheerfulness made him nervous. I feel excellent, sir, Izuku replied, trying to stay respectful. Thank you for asking. Excellent. 𝗎𝗎 smiled somewhat before turning to Momo. You are allowed to leave, Miss Yaoyorozu. Mr. Midoriya will be with you shortly. The teens shared a glance and Momo stood slowly. Okay then, sir, Momo said slowly, unsure how to respond. 𝗎𝗎's smile grew somewhat. Don't worry, it's just a few questions. It'll only take a moment. With that, Momo said goodbye to Izuku, leaving him alone with 𝗎𝗎, as Uraraka had left while Izuku and Momo had been treated. 𝗎𝗎 turned to him, face grave, and Izuku swallowed nervously. Now, Mr. Midoriya, as you can see, Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀 is unconscious and bandaged, 𝗎𝗎 began, voice perfectly even. He suffered severe injuries from your fight. Sir, I promise I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted tea. Izuku stopped as 𝗎𝗎 held up a paw. It is all right, Mr. Midoriya, he stated. You don't need to explain yourself. Toshinori explained everything to me. I know what Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀 did. Izuku relaxed slightly. From 𝗎𝗎's tone, it didn't sound like he was in trouble, but he stayed nervous just in case. However, 𝗎𝗎 continued. I do have a question for you, Mr. Midoriya. Why do you treat Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀 the way you do? Izuku did a double take. Of all the questions, that one was the least expected. I know of one for all, Mr. Midoriya, 𝗎𝗎 explained. Toshinori told me. Chio, or recovery girl to you, also knows. I bandaged the big buffoon up when he overdid it. Recovery girl cut in from her desk. You have the same heart as him, Midoriya. 𝗎𝗎 nodded. Yes, us teachers know of All Might's secret, and that he passed it down to you. I know of your formerly quirkless status. Izuku shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his arm and avoiding eye contact with the principal. Which brings me back to my question, Mr. Midoriya, 𝗎𝗎 stated. Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀 continuously insults you for your previous quirkless status, berating and yelling at you constantly about it. He's also attacked you 4 times while on UA grounds, 3 of which had been during class. Izuku rubbed his arm, flushing in embarrassment at being reminded of 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀's taunting. His nickname for you translates to useless, Mr. Midoriya, 𝗎𝗎 pressed. He's also threatened to kill you repeatedly, in full earshot of teachers, no less. So why then do you refer to him by a childhood nickname and worry for his well-being so much? Izuku bowed his head, feeling as if he were being scolded, even though that was the exact opposite of what 𝗎𝗎 was doing. Just now, when you and Miss Uraraka and Yaoyorozu fell out of the building, your first reaction after releasing Miss Yaoyorozu was to look for him, 𝗎𝗎 pointed out. A gesture he seemingly doesn't return. Izuku was silent, feeling an intense shame roll over his body as 𝗎𝗎 finished his speech. For years, he'd been clinging to a friendship that wasn't there anymore, in the hopes of 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀 changing, of becoming the person Izuku had known. Mr. Midoriya? 𝗎𝗎 asked, and Izuku looked up. I asked if that's okay with you, 𝗎𝗎 said. Izuku blinked, sitting up. Huh? What? What's okay with me? If Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀𝗀 were moved to another class, while you stayed in Class A, 𝗎𝗎 explained. He would also be placed on probation, and be 1 incident away from expulsion. I wanted to know if you believe that is sufficient punishment. What? Expulsion? Izuku asked, shocked. But what about his dream to be a hero? He's always wanted to be one. 𝗎𝗎 gave him an unreadable look before clearing his throat. While your, concerns for Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀𝗀 are noble, Mr. Midoriya, 𝗎𝗎 said, voice even. The fact remains that he has attacked you with the intent of causing serious harm 4 times now, and released an explosion that destroyed a reinforced wall into your face, and planned to do it again. Izuku looked away from 𝗎𝗎's piercing gaze. The tiny principal's eyes seemed to look into his soul. No hero would do such a thing, 𝗎𝗎 continued, his voice more gentle. We would normally expel him immediately, but given your continued concern, and the sheer amount of recommendations Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗀𝗀 received from his old school, I have decided on a slightly lesser punishment. 𝗎𝗎 cleared his throat again. We would normally move a student from another class into Class A to fill Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗏's place. However, no other students met the minimum requirements on the entrance exam to qualify. Izuku's brows furrowed. So his seat will stay empty? Until we can find a replacement, yes, 𝗍𝗓 nodded. Hopefully by the fall semester, depending on the results of your final exams. Izuku didn't know what to say. It felt odd, having someone stick up for him, since most adults usually sided with 𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗏. He smiled a bit. Maybe this was what being accepted felt like? However, 𝗍𝗓 continued. I do need to mention one thing for you. Izuku squirmed as Nizu's gaze pierced his soul, becoming sharp and stern. How such a tiny person could seem so intimidating, he would never know. Toshinori has recommended you train more with One for All, the principal explained, and Izuku relaxed somewhat, thankful he wasn't in trouble. So I give you permission to use the training rooms here at UA after school and on weekends, 𝗍𝗓 told him with a smile. It will allow you more mastery over your quirk, which hopefully should prevent any excess amounts of force. Izuku squirmed again. He couldn't tell 𝗍𝗓 it wasn't One for All that was doing that. If the principal knew, Izuku didn't know what could happen. I will have an access card printed for you, he continued. It will allow you and one other person, should you decide to tell them about One for All. Izuku blinked and stared at the tiny rodent. I'm allowed to do that? He asked, brows furrowed. But All Might said. Toshinori was correct. 𝗍𝗓 cut him off. You should keep this secret to yourself as much as possible. But there will be times you will need support, and I would think you'd prefer support from those your age. Izuku nodded shakily as he processed the information. Thank you, sir. 𝗍𝗓 smiled and clapped. Well, I suppose that covers everything. Please change into your school uniform and leave your hero costume in your locker. It will be taken to the costume department to be repaired. With that, Izuku left the medical wing, feeling slightly numb. So much had happened in the last few hours. Kaken was being moved and put on probation. Izuku was getting extra training. He was allowed to tell someone about his secret and had made a friend in Momo. And don't forget that thing with One for All, Marvin piped up, speaking for the first time in a bit. Izuku stopped and blinked. What thing? We used One for All, remember? We used it and didn't break our body, Marvin reminded him. Izuku felt excitement rush into him. You're right. I can't believe we did that. Do you think we could replicate it again? Marvin shrugged. Can't exactly say what it is we did different. We'll have to go over the memory. Izuku. Momo's voice made them look up. Momo ran over, now in her school uniform, and stopped in front of them. Izuku, are you alright? Are your injuries okay? She asked, brows knit together. Izuku flushed slightly when she said his name. Momo was the only person besides his mother who called him Izuku. It felt personal. Why yeah, I'm alright yeah Momo, Izuku corrected himself quickly. Thanks for asking. Momo smiled at his correction. Well, that's great. What was it that Principal 𝗍𝗓 wanted? Izuku explained everything to her as they walked, excluding the part about One for All, simply saying he was allowed to get more training after a recommendation from All Might. Whoa. A recommendation from All Might. Momo raised an eyebrow. Are you his successor or something? Your quirks are rather similar. Izuku tensed, going a bit pale. Marvin took over. Oh no, I'm just his student. He took me on for some training. What are you doing? Izuku hissed. She's going to find out about One for All. 𝗍𝗓 did say you could tell someone, Marvin pointed out. And no, she won't. According to your memories, heroes take students on as apprentices all the time. Momo's eyebrows shot into her hairline. Your All Might student? Like his apprentice. Izuku took over and rubbed his neck. Well yeah. It's not something I tell people about though. Momo nodded slowly. I see. I suppose I can see why. You don't want people to think of you as the one to take over once All Might retires, right? Izuku laughed nervously. Why yeah, don't want people to think that, right? They reached the locker rooms, and Izuku waved goodbye to Momo, who waved back. Izuku quickly changed into his uniform, took his shredded costume and put it in his case, and stuffed it in his locker, before rushing out just as the bell rang. That was close, Izuku muttered. We can't let her know about One for All. Why not? Marvin asked, genuinely curious. She seems trustworthy, doesn't she? Izuku bit his lip. Yeah, well, do you think she should be the one we should tell? Or Uraraka, Marvin suggested. They both have experience with you, and Uraraka saw your power at the entrance exam. But I'm on a first-name basis with Momo, Izuku pointed out. That has to count for something, right? The two continued their discussion their entire day, eventually settling on Momo, given that she already knew about All Might training them, and the diversity of her quirk could help them train more. Wait, wouldn't that mean you'd have to tell her about me? Marvin asked as they headed home. Izuku frowned. You're right. How would she react to that? Marvin shrugged. Question for another day? Izuku nodded. He had enough things going on at the moment. He didn't need to worry about something else at the moment. Marvin blinked and looked around. Where the actual hell was he? It wasn't Izuku's mind. In fact, it couldn't be any different. He was inside some kind of temple, adorned with gold markings. Marvin glanced down and saw he was wearing loose robes that felt oddly comfortable. Where the... He muttered, staring at the walls. It felt oddly peaceful here. Comfortable in an odd sort of way. It felt familiar, intimately so, but at the same time, Marvin had no clue where he was. He walked forward, glancing around for threats. Subconsciously, though, he knew there were none. How he knew? He had no clue. Marvin exited the temple, walking down goldenwood steps and into a courtyard. White brick tiled the courtyard, which was filled with a fountain, lush bushes and trees in specific spots, and surrounded by high red gates. Marvin looked around. There was just enough sound to keep him off edge, but not enough to overwhelm him. The sun was bright but not blinding, the smell in the air vague but pleasant, and even his clothes felt suited to him. Wherever he was, whoever had brought him here, had done their research, somehow. Marvin tentatively reached out to the fountain, out of which flowed crystalline water, almost more gem-like than liquid. His fingers brushed the cool water for nothing more than a second, but that was more than enough. Images bombarded Marvin's mind. Of lakes and rivers, of oceans and ponds, heavy rain and morning dew. But one stuck out most of all. A tank of water, glowing slightly, with a vaguely feminine body inside hooked up to tubes. He reared back, tumbling to the floor as his mind slammed back into the courtyard. His breath was shallow and eyes wide, his hands shaking slightly. Well, what the fuck? Marvin breathed, trying to control his breathing. He stood up shakily, brushing off his robes before he realized he was doing it. Marvin stared at the fountain, feeling anger boil up in his chest. His right hand shot up before he could stop it, and he pulled his middle finger back, hooking it under his thumb as if to flick something. Marvin paused and stared at his hand in bewilderment. What the hell was he about to do? He lowered his hand slowly, letting out a shaky breath. Whatever he was about to do, it was bad. Is this my mind? He asked aloud after a few minutes, staring back up at the fountain. Almost as if his words had broken a spell, the scenery around him began to crumble. Holes appeared in the sky, and Marvin stared wide-eyed as something stared at him through the abyss. It was utterly abhorrent, with jagged teeth and rock-like skin. It looked kind of like a soldier, or a guard of some sort, only completely monstrous, with blank eyes and a grin that kicked his adrenaline into high gear. The thing grinned down at him, and a giant hand reached out from the void as Marvin's mind began to crumble. His world collapsed around him. The temple began to groan and almost scream as it fell. Marvin blinked and threw himself back. Hundreds of bodies hung from spikes, chests impaled where their heart had been. He stepped back and heard a squelch. Marvin whipped around and recoiled as he saw the headless body of a girl, an X dug in blood over her chest. The thing in the sky laughed, and Marvin's heart rate skyrocketed. It reached again, its bony and dead hand reaching out to him. No. Marvin whispered, backing away and tripping over bodies. No, get away. Get away. The hand was within arm's reach, and Marvin saw a person emerge from the skin, and recoiled again. The beheaded girl from earlier reached out, only this time she had a head. His. Get away. Marvin shot up screaming, his body shaking violently and sweat drenching his clothing in bed. His breath was shallow and quick as his eyes darted around Izuku's dark room, desperately looking for the thing in his nightmare. A crash came from outside Izuku's room, and Marvin leapt up, screaming again and his adrenaline kicking into overdrive. 𝐒𝐭 burst into the room holding a metal pole, looking around frantically. "Izuku?" she asked, seeing Marvin shaking violently while backed into a corner of Izuku's room. Marvin stared at her with wide eyes, not fully processing that she was there. His mind was hazy. He could only see the hand. Only the hand. The hand and the girl. The girl. He could only see the girl. "Izuku? Are you alright?" 𝗵𝐽 exclaimed, dropping the makeshift weapon and rushing over to him. Marvin jerked violently as 𝗵𝐽 touched his shoulder, and she pulled back her hand as if burned. Marvin slumped down into a fetal position, trying to get his breathing under control. "Izuku?" 𝗵𝐽 tried again softly, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "I'm fine, Mom," Izuku managed to say. He'd woken up too from Marvin's nightmare. He took a deep, shaky breath. Just a nightmare. 𝗵𝐽 kneeled down beside him and tentatively pulled him into a hug. "It's all right, Izuku," 𝗵𝐽 whispered, rocking him slightly. "I'm here. You're safe." Marvin actually seemed to calm down slightly at 𝗵𝐽's soothing, his breathing becoming more level and even. "It was just a dream." "You're all right," she continued, stroking his hair. Marvin choked and nearly broke down again at the gesture, and mentally, he put a hand over the base of his neck tightly. 𝗵𝐽 stayed that way with him for a few minutes as both Izuku and Marvin calmed down. Eventually, 𝗵𝐽 pulled back, dried Izuku's tears, and kissed the top of his head. "Are you all right now, Izuku?" she asked softly, hands on his shoulders. Izuku gave a shaky nod after a moment, and 𝗵𝐽 smiled before standing a bit heavily. "Come on, get up," she said, helping him up. Izuku stood shakily, brushing himself off a bit. "Thanks. What was the nightmare even about?" 𝗵𝐽 asked in concern. "I've never seen you react so badly before. Are you all right?" Marvin nodded shakily. It was about Bakugo," he lied. "About what happened in the battle trial." 𝗵𝐽 squeezed his arm. "What happened, Izuku? Talking might help." Marvin shivered violently. He killed everyone. Everything collapsed. I couldn't save them." 𝗵𝐽 did a double take at the sheer hollowness in his tone and eyes. It felt like Izuku wasn't there, but back in the nightmare. His eyes looked like he'd seen death before. "Izuku?" she asked tentatively. Izuku took control back and managed a ghost of a smile. "I'm all right, Mom," he said, halfway genuine. "It's just... it felt so real, Mom." 𝗵𝐽 hugged him again. "It's all right, Izuku. You're safe. Everyone else is safe. They're all safe. They're all alive and well." Izuku gave a shaky nod. "Why, thanks, Mom. If you need anything, tell me, okay?" 𝗵𝐽 asked as she stepped back. "I'll do what I can, okay?" Izuku smiled at her. "Thanks, Mom. It means a lot." 𝗵𝐽 smiled back before she left with a final reassurance, leaving Izuku with Marvin. He looked into his mind, seeing Marvin sitting against the wall of his mind with the bookshelves, his back pressed to the wall and his side to the shelves. "She's nice," he muttered emptily. "Your mom?" "Yeah, she's amazing," Izuku replied, slowly walking over. He sat in front of Marvin, but Marvin didn't look at him, but instead stared at the ground. "They were real, Izuku," he muttered. "The people. They were real. Are you sure?" Izuku asked tentatively. "How do you know?" Marvin shrugged, his shoulders scraping against the wall. "I know," he said, picking at his pants. "I knew them. All of them." Izuku stayed silent. What could he say? He'd never dealt with what seemed like a trauma-induced nightmare. "The girl," Marvin whispered hollowly. "I knew the girl." "You did." Izuku tilted his head. "Who was it?" "The girl from before," Marvin told him. "The one who said she loved me." A dull shiver passed over his body, almost as if he couldn't feel anything correctly anymore. Her name was Renai," he muttered, feeling warmth on his tongue. I think I knew her." "Renai." Marvin nodded. It was the same body." "I don't know how I know." He drew his knees to his chest tightly and rested his chin on top. I killed her," Marvin whispered. I'm not sure how I know. But I know. I know I did." I'm so sorry, Izuku told him, not knowing what to say. Marvin bit down the anger on his tongue, but his fingers tensed and flexed, as if he were strangling someone. What would he know? Izuku barely knew what the hell it meant to have a spine against bullies, let alone whatever it was he saw. Marvin's sharp teeth drew blood from his cheeks and tongue, and he inhaled sharply as a new wave of anger rolled over him. He didn't want pity. He didn't want people's remorse. He didn't know why he didn't want it, but he knew he didn't. He wanted to be left alone. He wanted his body. He wanted to be able to run away and not be stuck with some wimpy teenager that kept making excuses for someone who abused him. A choking sound snapped him out of his thoughts, and he looked up. Izuku forced a smile through teary eyes, and Marvin remembered in horror that his thoughts weren't his in here. His eyes widened, and his anger left him like a leaf hit by winds. Izuku, I didn't. Marvin hesitated. Did he really mean it? He didn't know. Izuku bit back a sob, his lip trembling. It's okay. I know I'm not the best person to be stuck with, he whispered hoarsely. Marvin's thoughts were like a punch to the gut for him. Izuku thought them friends, and ignoring Bakugo, Izuku almost considered Marvin his first friend. It was why he was so comfortable letting Marvin take control. He knew Marvin wouldn't hurt him, not consciously, and the only thing he wanted was to make Izuku better. He'd never thought Marvin would dislike it in his mind. He should have known, of course, being stuck in someone else's head, only allowed to take control in certain situations, without your memories, surrounded by strangers, would be enough to anger anybody. Izuku. Marvin tried again, his horror nearly paralyzing him. Izuku, I'm so sorry. Horror and anger fought for dominance inside his head. His anger was fierce and brutal, but his horror was overwhelming and numbing. Marvin reached out and lightly touched Izuku's shoulder, trying to ignore the burning pain he felt when he did. Izuku stared at him, and there was an odd emotion in his eyes, one that Marvin couldn't exactly place. Look, Marvin stopped, trying to find words. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to hurt you. It's just that it's hard, okay? I barely remember anything about who I am or where I'm from. I'm not even in my country, since I learned Japanese from your memories and only spoke English before. Izuku nodded after a moment in understanding, and Marvin sighed in relief. He stepped back, letting go of Izuku's shoulder and running his hand through his messy hair. It's just frustrating, you know? I feel trapped here, he said, blowing out a breath. And I know, it isn't your fault, but I don't know, it's difficult, okay? He half questioned, throwing his hands up. It's hard. Yeah. I think I get it, Izuku muttered, looking down. I know you don't have a choice, but sometimes it gets uncomfortable having you in my head. I think anybody would be uncomfortable, but it still sucks. Marvin suggested with a soft grin. Izuku looked up at him and smiled. Yeah, it still sucks. They stayed quiet for a moment, seemingly digesting what the other had said and coming to terms with it. Do you think you'll be able to get your body back? Izuku asked after a while of silence. Marvin sighed. I'm not really sure. I don't fucking know what brought me here anyway, so it's not like I can retrace my steps. He shivered as his nightmare replayed internally. And I don't think I want to. Izuku nodded before they descended into silence again, more comfortable this time. The sun was rising now, and Izuku silently changed as it began to peek over the horizon. Do you think Nizu could help us? He asked as he pulled on his shirt. Who? The principal, Izuku replied, doing up the buttons. Aizawa-sensei mentioned how his quirk enhances his intelligence to a superhuman level. How would he help us? Marvin questioned, standing from the floor and stretching. Izuku shrugged. Maybe he has a method of separating minds from bodies? There has to be at least one quirk in the world that could do it. There are so many. Do you really want to tell him, though? Marvin asked. He might think you crazy or me a villain, and neither of those options are good. Especially since I can use one for all. He might think I'm trying to steal your quirk. Izuku frowned as he finished tying his tie. So what should we do? There's not really anything on something like this for us to look up. Marvin hummed in thought, weighing his options. He sighed after a moment. I guess our best bet is for me to stay here for a while. Maybe something pops up, From my memories or something. What from your memories could possibly help us here? Izuku asked as he rushed out the door after saying goodbye to his mother. Marvin shrugged. Maybe I can remember what caused me to be here? Then I can reverse engineer it and possibly get my body back. Izuku blinked. He hadn't thought of that. He shook it off and stepped off the train to UA, jogging out the entrance and into the street. Do you really think you can do that? He asked as he walked the rest of the way to UA. No clue, honestly. Better than nothing, though, was Marvin's reply. They quickly reached UA, and Izuku took out the pass 𝗎𝗓 had given him a few days prior as he reached the door. A small scanner popped out from the wall, and Izuku quickly entered after scanning his pass. You should take good care of that thing, Marvin said suddenly. Huh? Why? It's a pass into the most prestigious hero school in the country, and into its training rooms, filled with high-tech equipment, Marvin pointed out. Put that in the hands of a villain or an over-ambitious civilian, and that's a problem and a half. Izuku paled slightly at that. Marvin was right. There was no telling what a villain could do with unlimited access to UA. Aren't there wallets that need your fingerprint to open? Marvin questioned. I remember seeing those in an ad the other day. Izuku nodded. Yeah, but they're expensive. And I don't have money for something like that. Marvin paused his immediate reply on how they could easily get some money. Izuku heard anyway and his eyes widened. Marvin, we're not robbing innocent people. He cried, slightly distressed that was Marvin's immediate idea. They're not innocent. They're villains, Marvin corrected defensively. They won't miss the money. Stealing is still wrong, Marvin, Izuku replied as he entered the training room and put his bag down. Normally, he would change into his gym uniform and train in that, but Marvin's nightmare had pushed him later than usual, so he decided to train in his normal uniform and simply take the jacket and tie off. So is murdering people. But that doesn't stop the villains, Marvin retorted. Come on, just a handful. You'd be doing 2 acts of good. Protecting the pass and stopping villains. Vigilantism is illegal, Izuku reminded him. I could get in serious trouble if I decided to go out without my hero license. Marvin groaned loudly. Oh, come on. You're acting like we'd get caught. Izuku frowned as he remembered that one of Marvin's skills was hiding in plain sight, sometimes literally. It's still wrong, Izuku stated, pulling a training dummy out of a closet. The dummies were combat dummies. They would fight Izuku like a real person and had an inbuilt AI that would learn from him, adapt, and become better. They ranged from level 1 to level 5, with 1 being beginner and 5 being master. The dummies were still in a test run, but 𝗎𝗓 had given Izuku permission to use them. You're already going to come here to train, Mr. Midoriya, 𝗎𝗓 had said. Who better than to test these dummies than you? Izuku set the dummy up and started it on level 1, jumping back as it activated. I still think my idea is good, Marvin grumbled as Izuku began fighting the dummy. Izuku rolled his eyes and nearly got hit in the head as his focus wavered. And I think, he said between dodges. It's not. He slipped under a jab and struck the dummy in the chest, only for it to grab his arm and knee him in the side. Izuku grunted and doubled over, taking another knee to the jaw. He fell back, tumbling to the ground in a rather non-elegant fashion. Complete the training. Complete the training. Izuku half-shouted, hand raised to cover his face as the dummy approached him again. The dummy stopped, standing straight with its arms at its sides. Training complete. The robotic voice sounded before the dummy went limp and collapsed. Izuku groaned as he flopped onto the ground to catch his breath. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and he could already feel a bruise forming on his jaw. He was pretty sure he'd bitten his tongue too. It was rather numb. You lasted 7 seconds longer than last time, Marvin told him casually. Good. You're improving. Still a long way to go, Izuku panted. Marvin rolled his eyes. Well, obviously. Your movements are all stiff and janky. You move more like a mannequin than the dummy does. Mannequins don't move, Izuku groaned as he rolled to his side. You get the point, Marvin told him. Izuku sat up with a grunt, rubbing his sore side tenderly. I don't get it, he huffed, his hat in his other hand. What am I doing so wrong? I feel like I should have improved more by now. Relax, you've been doing this for less than a week, Marvin poked him mentally. You've got to give yourself time to adapt. Izuku groaned again and stood. It's still frustrating. I'm rewatching the memory of your fights and your movements look so fluid. It's like night and day. And? I'm pretty sure I'm older, and from what little I can remember, I've been fighting all my life. It'd be embarrassing if I didn't know how to. Marvin snorted. Izuku, just last week you didn't even know how to throw a punch without almost breaking your hand. Cut yourself some slack. Izuku sighed. Yeah, I guess you're right. Marvin rolled his eyes again. Come on, activate the dummy again and I'll show you what you did wrong. Deal. Deal. Izuku replied, ignoring his pain as he rushed forward to activate again. No, Marvin said as Izuku went to see the difficulty. Set it to 1. If you put it higher, it won't do the same moves. But that'll increase the difficulty when I do it, Izuku frowned. Isn't that kind of unfair? That's a good thing. It forces you to improve while still being manageable, was Marvin's reply as he took over. Now look, what you did is leave your side open with that jab, he began as he weaved under a punch. He switched footing and kneed the dummy in the back, sending it sprawling to the floor. See? When you dodge, you move everything. Not just your upper half, Marvin explained as the dummy got up. The dummy lunged at him again, throwing a tight uppercut. Marvin actually closed the distance, taking the hit to the chest before head-butting the dummy. Wait, why did you do that? Izuku asked as he mentally took notes. Diversity. If I always lean back from a strike before going in, then any skilled opponent's going to pick up on that, Marvin replied as he swept the dummy's leg. The dummy staggered back, its arms flailing wildly. Marvin rushed in from its left, grabbing the arm before throwing the dummy over his shoulder. A thunk sounded as the dummy hit the ground, but Marvin didn't let go. He pulled the dummy's arm back, twisting it and barely not dislocating the shoulder. See? You can't stick with just punches. If you do, you're a one-trick pony, Marvin told Izuku before he got up. Complete the training, he said, and the dummy went limp on the ground. Izuku hummed in thought. So you're saying I was too predictable? Exactly. A fight is about reacting as much as it is planning, Marvin explained. Sure, you can do quite a lot with just jabs, hooks, and whatnot, but it's better to have diversity. In order to avoid getting caught in a trap? And to give yourself more options, Marvin added. If you only do punches and break your arm, you just lost half your firepower. If you do punches, elbows, knees, and kicks and break your arm, then you've only lost a fraction. Izuku nodded, jotting everything down mentally. One benefit of Marvin's arrival was that he no longer really needed his physical journals. The awareness of his mental library and memories allowed him to write everything down mentally and remember it whenever he wanted. He still kept his physical journals, of course. He had too much of a habit not to, but the increased memory and processing ability really helped. Okay, I think I want to try again, Izuku declared, closing his mental notebook. Marvin nodded as he handed over control. Remember, be diverse. Try something out. If it doesn't work, that's okay. You can try again. Got it, Izuku breathed, crouching next to the dummy. He was about to activate it again when he heard the door to the training room open, and he turned. Oh. Good morning, Aizawa-sensei, Izuku greeted his homeroom teacher. Do you need anything? Aizawa studied him intensely for a moment. His black eyes narrowed as if searching for something. After a few moments, he cleared his throat. I came to tell you to take it easy today, Midoriya, Aizawa stated. We're doing some simulation training today, and I want you at the top of your game. Izuku nodded. Yes, sensei, he declared, standing straight. Good, I'll see you in class, Aizawa told him as he turned to leave. Izuku relaxed a little. Wait, where are we going? I didn't know UA had simulation zones. Aizawa turned his head slightly. It's called the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ. It's not far from here. He turned away fully. Get cleaned up soon. Class starts in, he checked the clock. Roughly an hour. Aizawa left, only half glancing at Momo as she entered the hallway. He gave a dull response as she greeted him. Not that she put it much mind as she headed to where Izuku was training. Aizawa entered the teacher's lounge and picked up his phone, dialing Nizu's number. You were right, Aizawa said after they exchanged greetings. Midoriya is like two completely different people. Interesting, Nizu said over the phone. I hadn't expected my hypothesis to be fully correct. I thought I'd at most be half right. Well, you were fully right, Aizawa replied. What do? We don't want to startle Mr. Midoriya, 𝗵𝗲 stated. We first have to determine the root cause of his dual personality. The first one's definitely Midoriya, Aizawa told the principal. Polite and reserved, but questioning. The second one, though, that one's different. How so, 𝗧𝗪𝗧? 𝗵𝗲 inquired. Any different from what we've previously determined? Whoever the second guy is, he's dangerous, Aizawa answered. He was speaking aloud, explaining something to who I presume to be Midoriya, while causally dealing with the training dummy you set up for him. Truly? 𝗵𝗲 asked. Did you hear any details? Anything that could clue us in? Aizawa rubbed his eyes. He's smart, good at fighting. He's probably a soldier from the way he spoke. The way he moves is completely different from even pro heroes. He fights like he wants to maim, incapacitate, and kill. 𝗵𝗲 frowned on his end. That's concerning. Anything else? He moves like Midoriya did when fighting Bakugo, Aizawa told him. He purposely took a hit to the chest in order to counterattack, much like what Midoriya did during the battle trial. Interesting, 𝗵𝗲 hummed. Perhaps it wasn't Mr. Midoriya during the battle trials. Aizawa frowned slightly. What do you mean? I'm saying it's possible the second individual was the one who injured Mr. Bakugo, 𝗵𝗲 explained. From what you're telling me, it's exactly like what Mr. Midoriya did back then. He cleared his throat. So there's a second individual who can switch control with Mr. Midoriya, seemingly at any time, is a capable fighter, can severely injure people as demonstrated with Bakugo, and seems to possess enhanced strength. If he's the one who broke the wall and floor, that is. He sounds like a villain, Aizawa commented. I wouldn't say that, 𝗵𝗲 said. A villain wouldn't let Mr. Midoriya take control back, and from the video feeds, the switch seems almost subconscious. Subconscious? 𝗵𝗲 nodded. Indeed. From what I can tell, this second individual only comes out when Mr. Midoriya gets attacked, usually by Mr. Bakugo, and disappears once he is out of danger. So a defense mechanism, Aizawa stated. Do you think it's a quirk? No, was 𝗵𝗲's reply. I have a few theories, but I'll need more information before I can determine anything concrete. Keep an eye on him, will you, 𝗧𝗪𝗧? Aizawa nodded. I'll give you any information I find out. Thank you, 𝗧𝗪𝗧, 𝗵𝗲 said before they exchanged goodbyes and hung up. At the same time as Aizawa entered the lounge, Momo entered the training room Izuku was in. Good morning, Izuku. She greeted, making Izuku look up at her. He smiled softly. Good morning, Momo. Momo glanced at the dummy Izuku was putting away and frowned slightly. You're not going to train more? There's still some time before class begins, she asked, slightly disappointed she couldn't watch. Oh. Well, Izuku rubbed his neck and turned to her. Aizawa-sensei told me not to train too much today. He said we're going somewhere called the USJ for extra training. Momo was only half listening. Her eyes were instead struggling to stay on his face. Izuku's sleeves were rolled up, his shirt unbuttoned and untucked slightly. His tie was loosely thrown over his neck, untied. Overall, he looked messy, but Momo found it hard not to stare. He looked older than he really was, emitting an odd sort of comfort and confidence he seemed to be unaware of. Momo, Izuku asked, staring at her. Momo, are you listening? Momo snapped out of her staring and flushed violently, her eyes dropping to the floor as her hands clutched her bag. Oh, sorry. Just got lost in thought, she said, looking up and pointedly ignoring the heat on her face. You were saying? Izuku blinked. Momo's face was bright pink, but she seemed to ignore it. Okay. Izuku shook it off, though subconsciously put it in the back of his mind. Anyway, I was asking you what you think our training would be today, Izuku told her. Momo paused and thought for a moment. You said it's called the USJ, right? Izuku nodded. Yeah, Aizawa-sensei told me it stood for the Unforeseen Simulation Joint. I've heard of it, Momo responded. It's this training center made to emulate real-life situations that pro heroes might encounter. It has different zones that specialize in certain areas from what I've heard. Izuku's eyes lit up. Really? That's incredible. Can you imagine how good of a training tool that is? Momo smiled softly as Izuku rambled about the different ways the USJ could possibly be used, though she got lost more than once. If she had to be honest, she had no clue how Izuku's mind created ideas so fast. It was fascinating to her, for someone her age to be able to come up with thought patterns like Izuku did. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and Izuku's rambling was cut short by the school bell, making them both jump. I'm so sorry, Momo. I didn't mean to make you late. Izuku cried as he quickly scrambled to look presentable. It's fine. At least the time was spent with you, Momo replied before she knew what she was saying. Izuku's head snapped up from his tie, slightly bug-eyed and his mouth hanging open. Momo flushed. I meant your ideas, she exclaimed quickly. They're fascinating to hear, and I'm really glad you share them with me. Oh, Izuku's face lost its shock, and he nodded a bit, as if in understanding. Right. He went back to tying his tie, and Momo frowned. Wait, Ikuno, she said, walking up to him. You're doing it wrong. She grabbed his tie and undid his haptic knot in a single, smooth motion. You leave it too short, she said as she began tying it. Did no one ever teach you? Her brows were furrowed, face knit in concentration to the point where she didn't even notice their proximity. Izuku, however, very much did, and his face was beet red. His eyes were squeezed shut, since his previous line of sight was directly to Momo's chest. Momo quickly tied his tie correctly, tightening it and stepping back some. There, she said, patting the tie. Momo froze in the next second and yanked her hand back, blushing as she realized what she'd just done. Part of her wanted to apologize profusely for the act, while another, more repressed part of her egged her on, pushing her to do it again. Her mind froze at the two options, not wanting to do either, so it picked a third option. Momo ran. She was out the door with her bag in less than a second. Her face still beet red as her shoes clicked on the floor, leaving Izuku stunned in the training room. Izuku stood, his mind slowly beginning to wake up again as he stared at the ground. There seemed to be fire on his chest where Momo had touched him, and he wasn't sure if he wanted it to end or not. Oh, I earthed to Izuku, Marvin drawled, snapping Izuku out of his shock. Huh? Wah. Marvin rolled his eyes. You can crush on 𝐒𝐬𝐫 later. You're late to class, idiot. I'm late to class. Izuku repeated, his mind kicking in again. He haphazardly threw on his jacket as he grabbed his bag and ran out the training room, his legs pumping under him. Izuku bolted into 1A, throwing open the door and stopping, slightly out of breath. You're late, Midoriya, Aizawa said as he and the rest of the class, bar Momo, stared at him. Why yeah, sorry about that, Izuku rubbed his neck. I was in the training room. Aizawa narrowed his eyes a bit. I thought I told you not to overtrain and get cleaned up? Izuku flushed in embarrassment. Sorry, Aizawa-sensei. I got distracted. Aizawa studied him critically for a moment before nodding. Take a seat, Midoriya, he said, turning back to the class. Don't let it happen again. Yes, sensei. Izuku barked before rushing to his seat. Wait, Midoriya gets specialized training? Todoroki asked. Why? Principal Nizi wanted Midoriya to test out a few pieces of equipment for him, Aizawa replied, not exactly lying. Aizawa stopped any follow-up questions by raising his hands, stopping Mina, Kaminari, and Ida from speaking. He quickly went over what they were going to do, told them about the USJ, to change into their costumes, and to meet him by the bus outside. I still think this thing is bad, Marvin muttered as they left the building in Izuku's hero suit. It's gotten better, Izuku replied. Izuku's hero costume had gotten repaired oddly quickly, and now held thin metal-like gloves, bracers for his elbows and knees, and a darker green color palette with hints of blue. You think you can have support items for one for all? Marvin asked. Like stabilizers or something? Izuku's brows furrowed as they got on the bus. I'm not sure. I don't think All Might had any support items. You're not All Might, was Marvin's reply. You can't copy everything he does. He's him, you're you. And I know, he's your inspiration and blah blah blah. Marvin cut off Izuku's rebuttal. Doesn't mean you should carbon copy him. Hell, it's better if you don't. Better? Marvin nodded. Think about it. All Might's a 7-foot-tall, 600-pound wall of muscle, smiles, and hair. Your average height, thin, and got your power a few weeks ago. Not exactly the same, is it? I mean, no, but why would it be better if I didn't copy All Might? Izuku pressed. Everyone looks up to him. He's the world's greatest hero. And you're a 15-year-old who can't look a girl in the eye, Marvin replied, somewhat annoyed. If you copy All Might word for word, beat for beat, all you're doing is limiting yourself. Let me put it this way, Marvin told him. All Might relies on mostly punches. We went over, not even 2 hours ago, how that's a terrible idea for you. He also seems to only have basic combat skills and mostly relies on his brute strength for most villains. Which works for him. He's been recording fighting for days. He has the stamina to back it up. He poked Izuku mentally. You don't. One for all breaks you in a single use. Until you get the control All Might has, you have to rely on combat skill, intelligence, and the occasional help from me. You can't carbon copy All Might, Marvin concluded calmly. Sure, take inspiration from him, imitate his confidence and kindness. But you have to be yourself. Didn't All Might himself say the most important part of a hero is their heart? You don't have his heart. Izuku frowned mentally. Yeah, what Marvin was saying was right, but it still stung quite sharply. He'd looked up to All Might all his life, and part of him wasn't sure how much of him wasn't inspired by All Might. He sighed and held his head. So what do I do? Look at other heroes, Marvin told him. There's thousands, past and present. There has to be someone you could take inspiration from. Izuku's reply was cut off as someone shook him sharply. He jumped. Huh? What the? Momo stared at him, hand on his shoulder. I was saying we're here, Izuku. Oh, right. Izuku said, looking out the bus. Thanks, Momo. Momo returned the smile Izuku gave, but internally, she frowned. She'd noticed Izuku's habit to zone out constantly. At first, she thought it was just a habit he had, similar to his mumbling. The more she looked into it, though, the more she grew concerned. Before coming to UA, she'd done some research on mental illness and trauma, and had brushed up on it after meeting Izuku. Izuku currently checked several boxes for childhood trauma. The zoning out, the frantic and constant apologizing, his struggle with talking to people, particularly girls, his almost meek nature at times. But the part that worried her the most were the switches. Out of nowhere, Izuku would go from quiet, shy, and polite to aggressive and brutal. He often didn't speak during that, and it looked almost subconscious, given how he seemed to snap out of it when startled. Momo silently wondered if Izuku had some kind of personality disorder, like DID or BPD, but she didn't know enough to guess. She also wondered if Bakugo had a place in it, given that the switches seemed more prominent around the blonde. Momo watched him as they entered the USJ, wondering if her friend, her first male friend and one of her first in general, had some underlying secret like she did. She wouldn't push, no, that was rude. She would be patient, build his trust in her, make him comfortable, and let him open up to her naturally, and hopefully she could do the same back. All Might will be arriving later, Aizawa was saying as Momo focused again. Until then, you will all be training in here, performing several exercises to test your ability to think like heroes. 13, the space hero continued. Aizawa nodded. Correct. All of you will be participating in several simulations. Aizawa's words cut off as a dark portal opened in the middle of the USJ, and the two pros, along with the rest of the class, turned. Villains spilled out of the portal, numbering in the dozens, with a variety of quirks. Aizawa gritted his teeth as he saw several mutant-type quirks in the midst. Whoever had invaded knew his quirk weakness. 13. Aizawa barked. Protect the students. His shot off, quirk active and eyes glowing. His quirk wasn't suited for this, but he didn't care. Aizawa-sensei. Izuku cried as Aizawa began battling. Midoriya no. Ida said, his hand on Izuku's chest to stop him. We're not qualified. Eraserhead's quirk isn't suited for multiple people. Izuku said, pulling away. Or to people with mutant-type quirks. 13 blocked his path. You can't go, Midoriya. You'll get yourself killed. I need to help. Izuku exclaimed, power brewing inside him. He leapt off over 13 in the class and into the middle of the fray. You're crazy, Midoriya. Marvin shouted as they landed. I'd rather be crazy for helping than not have the heart of a hero. Izuku barked. Izuku hit a villain twice in the jaw, dropping them before he turned to another. He dodged a punch and kneed the attacker in the stomach, making them double over. Midoriya. You're not supposed to be here. Aizawa yelled as he took down 2 villains. A hero should always be ready to help. Izuku yelled back, even at the cost of themselves. He caught a punch with a grunt and pulled the villain in. Marvin took over and swung the villain into one who'd gone for his back. He jumped back from a villain with knives for hair, eyes darting around. Marvin grabbed an unconscious villain by the ankle as he passed and pulled them up. The knife-hair villain lunged at him and Marvin blocked the attack with the unconscious body. The villain froze as her knives sunk into the skin, eyes widening. "Marvin!" Izuku exclaimed, eyes also wide. "Non-lethal, just painful," Marvin replied clippily. Marvin darted around and struck her liver, shattering a few of her ribs in the process. He lunged at a mutant villain, grabbing them by his 3 tails and slamming him headfirst into another attacker. A roar broke the air and Marvin winced. Some lumbering beast with an exposed brain walked through a portal, along with a thin man with a hand on his face. "Nice Halloween costume, jackass," Marvin yelled as he leaped over a group. He kicked the air and landed violently, throwing the group of villains away like rag dolls. "Nomu Shigaraki, the man with the hand," hissed. Scratching his neck. "Kill him." The abomination to all bodybuilders, birds, and exposed brains everywhere called Nomu screeched loudly. Marvin's eyes widened as Nomu appeared before him, fist raised. The ground exploded from its hit, throwing up violent winds and rock. "Midoriya no," Aizawa yelled in shock. "That's not how you greet strangers, asshole," Marvin shouted. Aizawa, Shigaraki, and Nomu all looked up, seeing Marvin rapidly falling through the air. "This is," he continued as he neared the ground. A deafening boom resounded through the USJ, rattling the windows and walls. Marvin grinned and stood, coughing a bit from the dust cloud. "Everyone," Marvin coughed. "Everyone knows you have to land a hit." An ear-splitting shriek came to his left, and Marvin barely blocked Nomu's fist in time. He flew out of the dust cloud from the force, but flipped and kicked the air to stop himself from crashing. "How the hell?" Nomu screeched again, making him wince before it exploded out of the dust cloud. Marvin leaped to the side, dodging another punch. He kicked it in the face, essentially eviscerating its beak into its skull. Marvin jumped back, sliding a little as he hit the ground. Nomu's face reformed with a sickening crunch, and Marvin scowled. "That's how great," he snarled, rolling his shoulders. "It's fast," Izuku observed. "Almost as fast as All Might. Strong too by that first punch. Regeneration too," Marvin added. It's like some kind of super soldier." He shivered subconsciously. Something deep inside him repulsed at the mere mention of it. He jumped over an attack and kicked it in the chest, caving in its ribcage. Nomu screeched as it staggered back, but its chest was already healing as it did. "Hit it as much as you want," Shigaraki shouted crazily. "Nomu is made to kill All Might. Nothing you do will do anything." "Made," Marvin shouted angrily, jumping back. Shigaraki scratched his neck. "Yes, made and built to kill the world's greatest hero." Marvin punched the Nomu away, unknown rage bubbling into him. "Change of plans. I'm fucking killing this thing," Marvin snarled, flexing his hands. "What? You can't do that," Izuku exclaimed. "That's wrong." "Izuku, this thing is an abomination to creation," Marvin snarled as Nomu rushed back. "It's as natural as a fucking robot. It's like tearing apart a laptop." "Watch," he said as Nomu attacked. Marvin twisted, blowing its forearm to pieces with a quick jab. The Nomu barely staggered before attacking again, already healed. "See?" Marvin growled, dodging. "It's not human." Izuku looked doubtful, unsure if it was the right thing to do. It didn't seem natural. That villain had literally said it wasn't, but it was still alive, wasn't it? Marvin kicked Nomu away. "Well?" Izuku hesitated. Could he still be a hero if he did this, if he let someone do this? "Can you be a hero if you let people die?" Marvin demanded. "You're the strongest in the damn class. If this thing doesn't go down with us, then no one's going to survive." Izuku gritted his teeth, pushing away his fear and doubt as he nodded. "Oh, okay, let's do it," he stated hesitantly, slightly nervous. Nomu attacked again, and Marvin caught the punch before tearing the arm out of its socket. He hit the 𝗏𝗵𝗲 with its own arm, managing to snap off part of the bone. The 𝗏𝗵𝗲 screeched and swung at him with one arm. Marvin leaped over it and stabbed 𝗏𝗵𝗲 in the brain with the bone. 𝗏𝗵𝗲 screeched and bucked, trying to throw him off. Marvin essentially used the bone as a rein on a bull, only the bull was larger, faster, and could regenerate. He held on tightly, shoving the bone deeper with one hand while gouging out its eyes with the other. Its regeneration is slowing down. Izuku yelled. Good. Marvin grunted. He tore off some of its skull, managing to gouge the other eye in the same motion. No. Shigaraki yelled. A dark portal appeared to Marvin's left, Shigaraki's hand outstretched through it. Marvin twisted, jumping off the 𝗏𝗵𝗲 and over Shigaraki's hand. He grabbed it by the wrist and pulled, ripping the arm clean off Shigaraki's body. A blood-curdling scream sounded as Shigaraki fell forward, subconsciously grabbing his stump with 4 fingers. Make it stop! Make it stop! Shigaraki screamed, tears down his now exposed face. The same black mist quickly enveloped Shigaraki, making him vanish instantly. Marvin landed behind the 𝗏𝗵𝗲, Shigaraki's severed arm in his hand. The 𝗏𝗵𝗲 stumbled around wildly, screeching painfully, but they were quieter, and its movements more sluggish. Marvin bounded forward, using the bone in Shigaraki's arm to stab 𝗏𝗏𝗲's throat. He roared as he pushed into it, snapping the bone into pieces and separating the joints of the neck. 𝗏𝗏𝗲 collapsed under its own weight, falling back with a half-regenerated arm and eyes. Marvin panted as he kneeled on top of 𝗏𝗏𝗲's body, eyes closed and arms still grasping Shigaraki's mutilated arm. It almost looked like prayer if you ignored the blood and gore, a dark, twisted prayer made by those who'd taken a life far too often. Marvin's ears rang, deafening everything else to silence. His arms and hands were shaky as memories flooded him. Terrible, terrible memories. He was standing, kneeling, sitting, crouching, holding dead bodies, all mutilated in some way. Blood stained his hands deeper than his skin, into his bones and organs. Blood of so many. Men and women, young and old, friend and foe, soldier and civilian, rich and poor. They all had their blood on his hands. Marvin's breath was shaky, his head pounding as he returned to the present. Izuku was stumbling over to Aizawa, who was injured but not severely. Aizawa was leaning against a small wall, holding his side as he caught his breath. The pros stared at them, his eyes widening at the dead and haunted look in Izuku's eyes. Oh, he knew that look all too well. Izuku and Aizawa locked eyes, and for a moment, neither said a word. Who? Aizawa asked finally. Izuku blinked. Huh. Who was it? Aizawa repeated softly. I know that look, Midoriya. Who was it? Izuku raised a trembling hand and pointed to the 𝗏𝗏𝗲, who was laid out in the middle of the USJ. Aizawa stared at it for a long moment, his face expressionless. Why? It wasn't accusatory or demanding. Simply curious. A flat, almost calm tone that took Izuku off guard. It was Marvin who answered. I couldn't be a hero if I let it hurt people, he whispered, still haunted by the memories. Aizawa took it differently and stood straight, hobbling over to him with some effort. It's not your fault, Midoriya. Aizawa grunted in pain, holding his side. Izuku stared at him, feeling as if Aizawa was speaking about something far beyond here. No matter what anyone tells you, what you tell yourself, Aizawa continued. It's not your fault. You did what you had to do. They chose their path. The same haunted look occupied Aizawa's eyes, but it was older, grayer, almost matured in comparison. The first one is always the hardest, Aizawa rasped. But the second one, if you're not careful, the second one's the easiest. Izuku bowed his head, not knowing what to say. Aizawa put a hand on his shoulder. You won't get there, trust me. I know you, Midoriya. You won't do it. Izuku nodded a bit, head still bowed. A scream made Izuku's head jerk up, and he and Aizawa were rushing over to the mountain zone immediately. Marvin took over and sped up before falling as a sharp pain went through him. Midoriya. Aizawa caught Marvin as he fell, hand on Marvin's chest. Ugh, I'm fine, Marvin grunted shakily. Just the fight with that 𝗏𝗏𝗲 thing hurt. His head pounded, and Marvin felt weakness overtake his muscles. Whatever usually gave him his strength was lower now, and he felt burned out. Izuku took over, and the pain receded along with Marvin's control, making them both blink. Quirk exhaustion. Izuku's eyes widened. What you're feeling is a lot like what quirk exhaustion is described like. You overexerted yourself. Great. Seems you were right, Marvin grunted. I do have a quirk, and it's being a bastard right now. Izuku managed to stand, shaking off the echoes of pain he still felt. I can still fight Aizawa-sensei, he declared, taking a deep breath. Aizawa studied him for a moment before relenting, continuing his way towards the mountain zone. One for all would come in handy right now, Izuku grunted, struggling to keep up with Aizawa. A bright flare exploded above the city zone, and Izuku froze as he saw it. Aizawa stopped, quickly glanced between Izuku and the city zone, and gritted his teeth. Midoriya, head over to the city zone and evacuate any classmates there. He barked quickly. I'll head over to the mountain zone. Meet me near the entrance. Izuku snapped out of it and nodded, running off towards the city as Aizawa continued to the mountain zone. He pushed himself as much as he could, but Marvin's speed was being sorely missed even as he did. You used one for all in the battle trials, right? Marvin asked slowly, still feeling a headache. Izuku slowed somewhat. Yeah, but I'm not sure how I did it. We wanted speed back then. Because the building was collapsing, Marvin reminded him. Imagine something like that happening now. Izuku hesitated. How could he just activate a survival instinct like that? Quick, Momo's going to die. Marvin yelled with all his force. Izuku jerked forward, subconsciously activating one for all as he ran. What the? Izuku's eyes widened as he looked down, and he slowed down a little. Keep going. Marvin barked, wincing in pain at his headache. You want Momo to die? Izuku sped up again, feeling one for all flow through his body. This might be working, but we are so not doing this again. Izuku exclaimed as he ran. Marvin groaned in pain and laid back in Izuku's mind, rubbing his temples as his headache increased. Cool, whatever. Just run, will you? He groaned. Izuku rushed into the city zone, almost directly speeding into Momo as he did. He managed to jump to the side at the last second, landing beside her and kicking up a small dust cloud. Izuku. Oh, thank God. Momo sighed in relief. Izuku turned to her and did a double take, his jaw falling open. Momo was bloody and scratched up, her right hand shaky as she held up a bent and twisted staff. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, and there was a deep gash in her side. Blood dripped down her forehead, and one eye was swelled shut, a nasty bruise already forming. Looks like I wasn't too far off, Marvin muttered. That snapped Izuku out of his shock, and he shook his head to clear it. Momo, what happened? Are you all right? He cried, getting closer to her. Momo managed a shaky nod, her blush invisible thanks to the blood on her face. I'm fine, or at least standing, Momo told him breathlessly. But I'm still not the worst off. She gestured in front of her, and Izuku saw Kaminari, Shoji, Kirishima, and Ashido on the ground in various states of injury. Shoji had all three of his right arms broken, a hastily bandaged stump in place of a hand on one of them, several scratches and bruises on the other arms, and several bandages on his torso. Kaminari was bleeding and unconscious, his breath shallow. His shoulder and knee were popped out of their socket, and his ankle was twisted. Kirishima was deeply cut and bandaged, also unconscious. There was a bleeding gash on his head near his ear, and his hand looked broken. Ashido was the best off, simply bruised a little and scratched, though there was a deep gash on her arm. What happened? Izuku asked in horror. Villain attack, Momo panted, leaning on her staff. They ambushed us. It was this big, bear-like thing, Ashido grunted, her voice hoarse. Kirishima and Kaminari threw everything they had at it. Nothing we did worked. I had to drop a building on it, Momo told him. That did it, but Kirishima and Kaminari got caught. Kirishima used his hardening to protect Kaminari, but it knocked them both out, Mina continued. Shoji dragged them out. The villain broke my arms, Shoji said quietly. Another managed to cut my hand off before he went down. Izuku stared in horror, his hands shaking. And Momo? He asked nervously, voice cracking. I fought the rest of the villains, Momo explained painfully. There were almost 20 of them. Ashido helped me at first, but one of them knocked her into a building and made her pass out. Izuku gaped at them, feeling more like he was in a war than a school for heroism. Head up, kid, Marvin grunted. They need you now. Kaminari and Kirishima won't be able to move by themselves. Momo's in no state to do so either, and Shoji's gonna fall unconscious from shock pretty soon. Izuku didn't respond, still silently horrified, and Marvin sighed internally. He took over and rolled his shoulders. Momo, are you able to send up another flare? Momo stopped to think and gauge her reserves. I'm sorry, Izuku, but my quirk's exhausted. Momo bowed her head. But I can't try if... No, Marvin barked before continuing more gently. Rest. I just wanted to know in case we could alert Aizawa-sensei, but it isn't needed. He approached Kaminari and crouched by him, taking a deep breath. With 2 sickening pops, Marvin relocated Kaminari's joints, forcing the boy to wake up with a gasp of pain. Relax. Marvin put a hand on Kaminari's chest. You're still injured. Don't put weight on the arm and knee for now. Ashido can help you. He moved over to Kirishima and put pressure on his head wound. Momo's eyes widened as Marvin tore his shirt open, and she blushed as he ripped it off and wrapped a piece around Kirishima's head. He quickly did the same for Shoji and Momo, but not for Ashido or Kaminari, as their bleeding wasn't as severe or in as important areas. All Might burst into the USJ as Marvin finished wrapping Shoji, face devoid of a smile. He disappeared a moment later, his speed too fast even for Marvin to track. Young Midoriya! All Might exclaimed as he appeared beside them. Marvin jumped a little at the sound, but managed to hide it as plain shock at seeing him. All Might! Izuku exclaimed as he took over. You're finally here. We need your help. He quickly explained the injuries, and All Might's face looked made of stone by the end. Not to worry, young Midoriya. All of you will be okay, All Might told them firmly. He quickly scooped them up and, in the next moment, they were in the center of the USJ, being set down gently beside their fellow classmates. Izuku looked around, somewhat relieved. From what he saw, almost no one else was as injured as he or those in the city zone were, with the exception of Jiro, whose ears were bleeding. The other teachers surrounded them, including Aizawa but not 13, who had been rushed out by All Might. Speaking of the world's greatest hero, villains were being dropped off by him as he ran around the USJ, still unsmiling. How are you holding up? Marvin asked after a while of them sitting there. Recovery Girl was there, treating the most injured and bandaging them. I don't know, Izuku whispered. This doesn't feel real. War is like that, Marvin told him. It never feels real. It all feels like a bad dream, only you don't ever wake up. We killed, Izuku said numbly. We did what we had to do, Marvin replied gently. If we didn't kill it, it would have hurt other people. More people would have ended up like Momo and the others. Izuku stared at the ground as Recovery Girl treated him, completely zoned out. He didn't hear her questions, nor her repeating them. His ears buzzed too loud for that. He'd killed. He'd really killed. Not in a video game or simulation, but in real life. He'd actually killed something living. Something whispered to him that it was necessary, but that didn't make it any better. The thought of murder possibly being a necessary part of hero work horrified him. The first one's always the hardest, but the second one, if you're not careful, the second one's the easiest. What Aizawa said haunted him. Was he really going to become a murderer? He didn't want to be. He wanted to be a hero. But heroes didn't kill, did they? Marvin stayed silent. If he tried to force Izuku to get over it, he wouldn't develop the necessary callousness to do so again if needed. He didn't want Izuku to kill again, but he needed to have the capacity to do it. There were times where pulling the trigger was the most merciful option. Young Midoriya. Izuku jumped as All Might placed a hand on his shoulder, and he looked up. All Might stared at him, smiling a little. I need to speak to you once we're done here. Is that all right? Izuku managed a shaky nod. Yeah, of course, All Might. He tried to stand, but stopped as All Might put some pressure on his shoulder. Rest, young Midoriya. You've done more than enough for now. Thank you. Izuku stared as All Might walked away, feeling something odd that he couldn't place. Go to sleep, Izuku. You're exhausted, Marvin told him. All Might's here, so are the teachers. Everyone's safe right now. I'm not sure if I can, Izuku admitted. Yeah, I'm tired, but I don't think I can do it. Try, Marvin insisted. As rude as this may seem, you'll need to be able to get over it if you want to keep living. He tried to say something else, but nothing seemed to fit. It was all just implied, so he shut his mouth instead. Izuku sighed. He didn't want to admit Marvin was right. It didn't feel right. Sure, maybe it hadn't been him specifically who'd done it, but it was still his body, his hands. He'd been used as a tool for murder. Eventually, he managed to fall into an uncomfortable and turbulent sleep, twisting and turning as he did. Recovery Girl covered his upper body with a blanket, and Izuku subconsciously huddled into it for warmth. Aizawa stared at him, wondering if to call this in to Nizu. It was concerning, but he also didn't want to startle Izuku. He sighed and leaned back against the wall he was sitting against, deciding to close his eyes instead. As for the rest of the class, only rumors, whispers, and nervous looks spread through them, most of them directed at Izuku.